There is a wall in northern England that the Romans built to keep something out, not to keep their empire in, not to protect a border. In the ordinary way, a wall protects a border. The Romans built walls around territory they intended to govern, and they built walls along frontiers where they expected the outside to push against the inside. Hadrian's Wall, the one that runs for 73 miles across the narrowest part of Britain, is different from all of those. It is a wall that Rome built because it had already tried to go further north and decided not to. Because what was north of that wall was something the Roman Empire looked at, assessed in the way that Roman generals assessed threats, and concluded was not worth the cost of taking. And that conclusion, coming from an empire that had swallowed Gaul and Spain and Egypt and the whole of the Mediterranean world, is a statement worth sitting with. The story that gets told about Roman Britain usually goes like this. Rome arrived in 43 CE under the Emperor Claudius. The legions pushed north and west. They built roads and forts. They pacified the tribes of the south. They pushed into Wales and subdued it. They pushed into northern England and fought the Brigantes. And then they pushed further north, into what we now call Scotland, and at some point the story becomes vague. There was a general named Gnaeus Julius Agricola who campaigned in the north in the late 1st century. He won a great battle called Mons Graupius somewhere in the highlands. And then the Romans came back south, and eventually they built Hadrian's Wall, and that was where the empire ended. What that version of the story leaves out is everything that makes the north of Britain strange and unexplained. It leaves out the fact that Agricola campaigned in Scotland for 7 years, from 77 CE to 84 CE, and at the end of those 7 years the Roman army walked back out of the territory it had spent 7 years fighting through. It leaves out the fact that the Romans then built a second wall, the Antonine Wall, further north, and occupied it, and then pulled back from that one too, not once but twice. It leaves out a legionary fortress at a place called Inch Tuthil, the most expensive military installation the Romans ever built in Britain, which was completed and then deliberately dismantled without ever being used, and every one of its iron nails, nearly 1 million of them, buried in a pit so they could not be taken and used by the enemy. It leaves out the surveillance system called the Gask Ridge, the oldest known artificial frontier in the history of the world, predating Hadrian's Wall by 4 decades. And it leaves out the people the Romans were watching. The people who made the Roman Empire decide, not once but repeatedly, that the north was a problem better left alone. Those people did not call themselves Picts. That name was a Roman one, appearing in written records for the first time in 297 CE, and what it meant to the Romans who used it is not entirely clear. It may have meant painted ones, referring to the tattoos and body paint that Roman sources describe. It may have meant simply the Picti, a word whose roots are disputed, carrying connotations of a people known for what they put on their bodies. But the people of northern Scotland long before the Romans arrived, and the people who inhabited those landscapes for thousands of years, had their own identities and their own names and their own civilizations. And the trace they left behind is one of the most genuinely perplexing and underexplored records in the history of the ancient world. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. I am going to take you through the north of Britain, through the archaeology and the history and the things that even careful historians find difficult to fully account for, and I want you to be comfortable doing it. This is the kind of story that rewards a slow pace. This has been sitting in the ground for 2,000 years and more, and it can afford to be told without hurrying. So settle in. Close your eyes if you want to. The story will carry you. What was in Scotland before the Romans arrived? That question sounds simple, and the answer has layers that go very deep. The people living in northern Britain in the 1st century CE had been there, in one form or another, for thousands of years. Their ancestors had arrived after the ice retreated, had lived through the long warming, had built the monuments at Orkney that predated Stonehenge, had erected the stone circles, had constructed the hillforts. But by the Roman period, the communities of the north had developed into something recognizable to Roman eyes as a series of tribal confederations. The Romans gave them names. The Caledonii occupied the central and northern highlands. The Vacamagi lived in what is now Moray and Aberdeenshire. The Texali were in the northeast. The Venicones lived in Fife and Angus. The Damnonii occupied the Clyde Valley, in the territory that is now Glasgow. The Selgovi and Novante held the southwest. The Votadini controlled the southeast, the territory around what is now Edinburgh. These names come from Ptolemy, the 2nd century Greek geographer, who compiled a map of the known world that included Britain, and the names are all we have for most of these groups. The tribes of the south of Britain had been generating their own coinage, their own written records on artifacts, their own Latin correspondence with Roman merchants long before the invasion. The tribes of the north, particularly those above the line that Agricola would push to, had none of that documentary record. They existed archaeologically and in the Roman accounts of people who encountered them as enemies. What the archaeology tells us about their material culture is striking in ways that tend to get underplayed. The metalwork tradition of pre-Roman and Roman period Scotland is extraordinarily sophisticated. There is an object called the Tor's pony cap, found in Dumfries and Galloway, dating to the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, which is a decorated bronze cap originally interpreted as a helmet, but now understood to be a pony head covering. The decoration on it is Latène art, the continental Celtic art tradition, but the execution is distinctively local. The swirling patterns, the repousse work, the careful control of space and line represent a level of metalworking skill that took generations to develop and refine. This was not a people making functional objects. This was a people investing enormous craft energy in objects that were beautiful and meaningful and expensive, objects that told something about the status and sophistication of whoever commissioned them and whoever made them. There is a war trumpet found at Deskford in Aberdeenshire, now in the National Museum of Scotland. It is called the Deskford Carnix. A carnix was a Celtic war trumpet held vertically above the head, with the bell end shaped like the open mouth of an animal. The Deskford Carnix is the bell end of one of these instruments, cast in bronze, shaped as a boar's head with articulated lower jaw and a wooden tongue. It dates from approximately the 1st or 2nd century CE, placing it exactly in the period of Roman contact. Roman writers describe the carnix as an instrument that made a terrifying sound, and the image of carnixes appears on Trajan's column in Rome, carried by Dacian warriors on the other side of the empire. The Roman Empire encountered this instrument at the edges of its reach, in the north and in the east, in the places where it pushed hardest and found the hardest resistance. The people in Aberdeenshire who made the Deskford Carnix were making it in the same period that Roman soldiers were marching through their territory, and they were making it at a level of technical and artistic sophistication that required specialist knowledge, specialist tools, and a social structure capable of supporting specialist craft production. That social structure is visible in the archaeology in other ways. The hillforts of Scotland, the enclosed defended settlements, built on promontories and ridgelines throughout the country, are evidence of organized communities capable of sustained collective labor. Building a hillfort is not a small undertaking. The timber-laced ramparts, characteristic of Scottish hillforts, required the felling and transportation of large quantities of timber, skilled carpentry, to construct the internal framework, and the muscle power of many people working together under some form of coordinated direction. Vitrified forts, a distinctively Scottish phenomenon, went one step further. At some point, whether accidentally or deliberately, the timber lacing in these ramparts was burned at temperatures high enough to fuse the stone into glass, producing a vitrified mass that is extremely strong and difficult to dismantle. The debate over whether this vitrification was intentional is unresolved, but the result is a defensive structure of considerable durability. There are over 60 vitrified forts in Scotland, concentrated in the Highlands and the northeast, exactly the territory where Roman penetration was most difficult. The Roman general who came north and changed everything was named Gnaeus Julius Agricola. He arrived in Britain as governor in 77 CE, already experienced in the province from an earlier posting, and he moved immediately and systematically. In the first 3 years of his governorship, he consolidated Roman control over Wales and northern England, subduing the Ordovices of North Wales and establishing firm Roman authority across the Pennines. In his 4th year, 80 CE, he crossed the boundary into what is now Scotland and began pushing north. He built forts. He advanced in disciplined stages. He used his fleet to support his land operations, sailing along the coasts while his army moved inland. He pushed further north than any Roman general before him. In 82 CE, his 6th year, he operated in the southwest of Scotland and apparently contemplated crossing to Ireland. A small Roman fleet, according to Tacitus, who was Agricola's son-in-law and wrote the biography of his campaigns, reconnoitred the Irish coast from the Scottish shore. In his 7th year, 83 CE, Agricola moved decisively north toward the Highland Massif, gathering the tribes before him and forcing a confrontation. The Battle of Mons Graupius, almost certainly somewhere in Aberdeenshire or Moray, was the largest set-piece engagement the Romans fought in northern Britain. Tacitus gives the figure of 30,000 Caledonian warriors on the field. The modern consensus is that this number is inflated, as ancient writers routinely inflated enemy numbers to make victories more impressive. But the engagement was real, and the Roman victory was real, and then something happened that Tacitus handles carefully and that the archaeology makes more clear. Agricola was recalled. The Battle of Mons Graupius was in 83 or 84 CE. Agricola left Britain in 84 CE. The reason Tacitus gives is that the Emperor Domitian was jealous of Agricola's success and recalled him to prevent him from becoming too prominent. This is possible. Domitian was not a comfortable emperor to serve under, and Tacitus had no love for him. But there is another explanation visible in the archaeology that does not require any theory about imperial jealousy. The Romans marched back south. They dismantled their northernmost installations. They pulled their garrisons back, and they left the territory north of the Fourth Clyde line, essentially in the hands of its previous occupants. The most dramatic evidence of this withdrawal is at Inchtoothill, in Perthshire, on a bend of the River Tay. Inchtoothill was a legionary fortress, designed to house an entire Roman legion, approximately 5,000 soldiers. It is the northernmost legionary fortress ever identified in the Roman Empire. Its construction began in approximately 83 CE during Agricola's campaigns, and it was completed to a high standard. There are the remains of 64 barracks, blocks, granaries, a headquarters building, a hospital, workshops, a bathhouse. It is the most complete plan of a Roman legionary fortress anywhere in the British Isles. And it was abandoned and deliberately dismantled before it was ever occupied by the legion it was built for. The excavations at Inchtoothill in the 1950s and 1960s found, buried in a pit beneath the workshop floor, 875,000 iron nails, nearly 1 million nails. They ranged in size from small tacks to massive spikes 40 centimeters long. They were buried in neat layers, sorted by type. The effort required to do this was substantial. The reason for it is not hard to understand. Rome was abandoning a position, and it did not intend to leave useful materials behind that could be recovered and used by the enemy. Iron was valuable, nails were useful, burning them was not practical. So the Romans buried them in a pit under a workshop floor, covered it carefully, and walked away. The nails sat in that pit for 19 centuries until archaeologists found them. The abandonment of Inchtoothill is one of the clearest statements Rome ever made about the north of Scotland. A legionary fortress represents an enormous investment of resources, labour, and planning. The decision to abandon it before it was even occupied and to bury nearly 1 million nails rather than transport them south indicates that the withdrawal was rapid and that the assessment had changed. Something had changed the Roman calculation about whether holding the north of Scotland was worth the cost. What had changed was the resistance. The tribes of the north had not been broken by Mons Graupius. A battle victory does not translate into pacification when the enemy is tribal, mobile, and willing to continue fighting on their own terms. The Caledonii and the other confederations of the north could not be decisively defeated by winning a single open-field engagement because they did not depend on the kind of fixed infrastructure that a Roman victory could neutralize. They had no capital city to be captured, no central treasury to be plundered, no administrative apparatus to be decapitated. They had hillforts, dispersed settlements, kinship networks, and the ability to melt back into terrain that the Roman army, trained and equipped for open-field combat and road-based logistics, found genuinely difficult. The Gasque Ridge system is the most concrete evidence of what Rome did in the face of this problem before it decided to abandon the north altogether. The Gasque Ridge runs through Perthshire, in the territory south of the Highland Massif and north of the Forth Valley. Along it, the Romans built a series of watchtowers, placed at intervals of about half a Roman mile, connected by a road. There are also small fortlets at longer intervals. The system runs for approximately 18 miles. It dates, based on the pottery and coin evidence, to the Agricolan period, to the late 1st century CE. This makes the Gask Ridge the earliest known artificial frontier system in the world. Hadrian's Wall, the most famous Roman frontier, was built in the 120 CE. The German limes, the frontier system across Germany, was developed through the 2nd century. The Gask Ridge precedes both of them. And it was not built along the edge of Roman territory in the north of Scotland to keep the Romans in. It was built to watch the north. The watchtowers were spaced at intervals that allowed each one to be visible from the next, creating a chain of observation. Soldiers stationed in these towers could see movement on the ground below and could signal to the adjacent towers. It was a surveillance system, a way of watching a frontier that Rome controlled tenuously and that the people beyond it did not accept. The people beyond it left their own record of this period. There are Roman objects, Roman coins, Roman pottery, Roman military equipment found in sites across Scotland, north of the Gask Ridge and north of Hadrian's Wall. Some of this material got there through trade. The Roman Empire was a major source of high-value goods, and northern Britain had connections to the continental trade network through indirect routes. But some of it got there in other ways. Some of it represents loot, objects taken in raids on Roman positions. Some of it represents diplomatic exchange, the formal giving of gifts that characterized Roman frontier diplomacy. And the distribution of Roman material in northern Scotland tells a story about a frontier zone that was not simply a line between civilization and its absence, but a complex, contested, negotiated space where the people on both sides knew each other, traded with each other, fought each other, and influenced each other. The most spectacular Roman material found in Scotland, north of Hadrian's Wall, is the Traprain Law hoard. Traprain Law is a hill in East Lothian, in the territory of the Votadini, the tribe who occupied the southeast of Scotland and who maintained a complex relationship with Rome. The hoard was found in 1919, buried on the summit of Traprain Law, and it is the largest collection of Roman silver found anywhere outside the Roman Empire. There are approximately 250 objects, most of them hack silver, objects cut into fragments as if for recycling. They include silver plate, spoons, flagons, bowls, cups. They include early Christian silverware with Chi-Rho monograms. The silver dates from the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE, the period when the Roman Empire in the West was fragmenting under barbarian pressure. Where did it come from? 3 main theories exist. It may be loot, silver taken in raids on Roman Britain or on the continent in the period of imperial collapse. It may be tribute, silver paid by Rome to the Votadini in exchange for maintaining peace on the northern frontier. Or it may be diplomatic exchange, gifts given by Rome to the Votadini as part of a formal alliance arrangement. All 3 theories have supporting evidence. The hack silver format, the cutting up of objects into fragments of roughly equal weight, is consistent with the way loot was divided among raiding parties. But the sheer quantity and the quality of the material, including early Christian liturgical objects that would have had no market value as scrap among a non-Christian population, also suggest a more formal origin. What the Traprain Law hoard demonstrates beyond any dispute is that the Votadini, one of the tribes Rome encountered on the northern frontier, were receiving Roman silver in enormous quantities in the late imperial period, and that the relationship between the Votadini and Rome was one of the most significant frontier relationships in the Western Empire. There is a speech that Tacitus puts in the mouth of a Caledonian chieftain before the Battle of Mons Graupius, and it is worth reading carefully, not because it represents what the chieftain actually said, because Tacitus was not present and wrote his account decades after the events, but because of what it reveals about how Rome understood the people it was fighting. The chieftain is named Calgacus, and his name is the earliest recorded name of a named individual from northern Scotland. Tacitus gives him a speech of such eloquence and moral force that it has been quoted and admired for 2 millennia. Calgacus tells his men that they are the last free people of Britain, that beyond them there is no land and even the sea offers no refuge because the Roman fleet lurks there. He describes Rome as a civilization that plunders the world, that calls robbery and slaughter by the name of government, that makes a desert and calls it peace. Those last words, in the Latin, are solitudinem faciunt pacem appellant. They are among the most quoted Latin phrases in history. They have been used in anti-colonial literature and political speeches, from the 18th century to the present day. And they are placed in the mouth of a man from the Highlands of Scotland by the Roman historian who was also the son-in-law of the Roman general who had come to conquer him. Tacitus was a sophisticated writer, and one of the things historians have long noticed about the speech of Calgacus is that it serves a purpose in Tacitus's larger project. Tacitus was writing about Rome as well as about Caledonia, and the freedom and ferocity of the Caledonians functions in his narrative as a critique of Roman decadence and imperial overreach. The noble savage in the wilderness, uncorrupted by civilization, was a rhetorical device available to Roman writers, and Tacitus used it. But the device works precisely because the audience would find it believable. Tacitus could not give Calgacus a speech about Roman tyranny if his Roman readers did not know that the people of the north had resisted Roman expansion with genuine ferocity and persistence. The speech works because the resistance was real. What we know of Calgacus is only what Tacitus tells us. The name, the speech, the battle. He is not mentioned again after Mons Graupius. Whether he survived the battle, whether he continued to lead resistance, whether he died in the fighting, is unknown. He appears for a moment, gives the most eloquent anti-imperial speech in ancient literature, and then disappears from the record. That disappearance is itself significant. The Caledonians had no tradition of writing. They did not produce records that survived. The Romans wrote about them, and the Romans had their own reasons for what they chose to record and what they chose to omit. Calgacus is real enough to have a name and a battle. He is not real enough to have a grave. But the people of the north were undeniably real, and the traces they left in the ground are extraordinary. The question of what happened to those people, the pre-Roman inhabitants of Scotland and the people who lived there during and after the Roman period, leads into one of the most fascinating, unresolved problems in early British history. At some point in the historical record, the various tribes of northern Scotland converge into a single entity known to history as the Picts. And the Picts are one of the most intriguing and most completely mysterious peoples in the entire early medieval world. The name Picts appears in 297 CE in a Roman panegyric, a speech praising the Emperor Constantius Chlorus. The writer mentions the Caledonians and other Picts, using the word as if it were already familiar, as if Roman audiences already knew who the Picts were. This is the first written attestation of the name, but it implies that the identification was not new. The Romans had been interacting with the people of the north for over 2 centuries by 297 CE. They had watched them from the Gasgridge towers. They had fought them in 3 campaigns. They had paid them in silver, possibly. And at some point they had begun calling them by a collective name, the Picts, which unified under one designation the many tribal groups who had resisted Roman expansion. The Pictish symbol stones are the most compelling material evidence of a civilization. There are approximately 200 of them, distributed across eastern and northern Scotland, from Fife in the south to Shetland in the north. They are carved stones, some natural boulders and outcrops, some carefully dressed rectangular slabs, bearing a distinctive repertoire of symbols that appears consistently across the entire distribution area. These symbols include what are called the double disc and Z-rod, the crescent and V-rod, the rectangle, the mirror and comb, the triple disc, the tuning fork, the beast or swimming elephant, the salmon, the eagle, and a range of animal and human figures. They also include elaborately interlaced knotwork decoration that at its best equals anything produced in the contemporary manuscript tradition of Ireland and Northumbria. The mystery of the symbol stones is the symbols themselves. They are obviously meaningful. The consistency of their form across 2 centuries and across a territory of hundreds of miles makes it clear that they were not random decoration. The same symbols appear in the same combinations on stones from Shetland and stones from Fife, suggesting that whoever carved them was working within a shared system of meaning that was understood and maintained across a wide area. But what the symbols mean is completely unknown. Despite a century and a half of scholarly effort, no one has successfully deciphered the Pictish symbols. Various theories have been proposed. The symbols may represent personal names, used to identify the people buried near the stones, or to mark the territories of particular families or lineages. The symbols may represent a heraldic system, functioning the way coats of arms later functioned in medieval Europe, as visual identifiers of noble houses and genealogical claims. The symbols may represent a form of script, encoding sounds or words in visual form. Some scholars have argued that the mirror and comb symbol is specifically a female identifier, suggesting that stones bearing it mark women of high status. But all of these theories remain unconfirmed, because the Picts left no bilingual text, no Rosetta Stone equivalent that could unlock the system by providing a parallel text in a known language. The Ogham inscriptions found on some Pictish stones have been proposed as a key. Ogham is a writing system used in Ireland and parts of Western Britain that encodes an alphabet using groups of lines cut against an edge. There are about a dozen Pictish Ogham inscriptions, and the letters can be read because the alphabet is known from Irish examples. But the words that the letters spell, when read as Irish or Welsh or Latin or any other known language, do not produce intelligible meaning. The Pictish Ogham inscriptions are in a language that we cannot read, in a writing system that was not designed for that language and that produces phonetic sequences that no known language can decode. They may be in the Pictish language itself, whatever that was, written phonetically in a borrowed alphabet, and the Pictish language is unknown. This is an extraordinary situation. We have roughly 200 carved monuments produced by a people who were literate in the sense that they used a borrowed writing system and who operated a consistent visual communication system across a large area. We have their symbols in stone. We have their inscriptions in a borrowed alphabet. We have Roman descriptions of their warfare and their society. And we cannot read any of it in the deepest sense. We can see the shapes. We cannot understand the content. What we do know about Pictish society comes from a combination of archaeology, Roman accounts, Irish and Northumbrian sources, and the Pictish king lists, which are among the longest king lists in early medieval Britain. The king lists record the names of Pictish kings and their reigns going back to a legendary founder, and while the early entries are clearly legendary, the later entries, from roughly the 6th century forward, are supported by references in Irish annals and Northumbrian sources. The list of Pictish kings is longer and more detailed than the king lists of many contemporary kingdoms. The Picts had a complex, structured system of royal succession, apparently involving matrilineal elements, and their kingdom, at its height in the 7th and 8th centuries, was one of the most powerful political entities in northern Britain. The place called Burghead, on the southern shore of the Moray Firth in northeastern Scotland, was the largest Pictish fort ever identified. The promontory fort at Burghead occupied an area roughly 400 metres by 100 metres, making it significantly larger than any other known Pictish stronghold. It was defended by multiple ramparts with stone revetments, and it appears to have served as a major centre of Pictish power in the north. Most of it was destroyed in the 19th century when the town of Burghead was built, the Victorian builders quarrying the ancient ramparts for road metal with characteristic indifference to what they were destroying. What survived from Burghead are the bull carvings. There were originally approximately 30 carved stone panels depicting bulls in a naturalistic style found built into the walls of the newer structures as the old ramparts were demolished. Of these, about 6 survive in reasonably complete condition. They show bulls in energetic, lifelike poses, carved with considerable skill and with a sensitivity to animal movement that is striking. The bulls at Burghead are not heraldic symbols in the stiff, conventional style of some Pictish animal carvings. They are attempts to capture the thing itself, the weight and energy of a large bovid animal, and they succeed. They have been compared to the best animal art of the classical world. What the bull symbolized at Burghead is not known. There is a theory that Burghead was associated with a bull cult, a form of religious practice centered on the sacrifice and veneration of cattle. The spring near the fort, a rock-cut well now called the Burghead Well, is a chamber cut into the bedrock with steps leading down to a natural water source, and it has been proposed as a ritual site. Bull sacrifice is attested in Roman and pre-Roman religious practice, and in Irish mythology, cattle and bulls carry enormous symbolic and practical weight. The concentration of bull imagery at the largest known Pictish stronghold may indicate that this was a site of major religious significance, as well as a centre of military and political power. The Romans knew Burghead, or at least knew of it. The Moray Firth is one of the deep northern inlets that cuts into the Highland Massif, and Agricola's fleet, according to Tacitus, sailed around the northern coast of Britain, mapping the coastline and establishing that Britain was indeed an island. The fleet would have passed the entrance to the Moray Firth. Whether it entered the firth, whether it observed the promontory that would later become Burghead, is not recorded. But the concentration of Pictish power in the Moray area, precisely the territory that was farthest north and that the Roman army reached only at the extreme limit of its campaigns, is suggestive. The Romans were pressing north against a polity whose major centre was on the southern shore of the Moray Firth, and the people at that centre were watching the Romans press north and choosing how to respond. A fort of Burghead's size required a large and organised community to build and maintain. The ramparts, the revetment walls, the internal structures, the water supply system, all represent sustained collective investment over an extended period. The bull carvings represent specialist artistic production. This was not a temporary refuge or a simple defended enclosure. It was a capital, in the sense that a centre of political authority and organised administration was a capital. The community that built and inhabited Burghead was complex, stratified, and capable of generating the surplus resources necessary to support craft specialists, military forces, and the construction of major public works. The monastery at Port Mahomac, on the Tarbat Peninsula that juts into the Moray Firth north of Inverness, was excavated beginning in 1994 by a team led by the archaeologist Martin Carver, and the results of those excavations transformed understanding of Pictish society. Port Mahomac sits on a peninsula that appears repeatedly in the historical sources as a place of significance. The excavations found a sequence of occupations spanning from the Iron Age through the medieval period, but the Pictish phase, dating from the 6th through 9th centuries CE, was the most revealing. The Pictish monastery at Port Mahomac was a major centre of manuscript production. Carver's team found the remains of cattle hides prepared as vellum, the animal skin writing material used in early medieval manuscripts. They found evidence of pigment production, the preparation of the inks and colours used in illuminated manuscripts. They found the remains of the buildings associated with these activities, the scriptorium where manuscripts were prepared and copied, and they found carved stone monuments of high quality. The combination tells a story of a specialized religious and intellectual community producing manuscripts and monumental art in the 6th through 8th centuries. This is important for several reasons. It confirms that the Picts were participating in the manuscript tradition of early medieval Christianity, the same tradition that produced the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels and the Book of Durrow. The Hilton of Cadboll stone, one of the most elaborate and celebrated of all Pictish carved cross slabs, was found near Port Mahomac and is almost certainly associated with the monastery. The interlaced knotwork and the figural scenes on the Hilton of Cadboll stone are as sophisticated and as beautiful as anything in the great insular manuscripts. The Picts were not peripheral to this tradition, they were participants in it at the highest level. The excavations at Port Mahomac also found evidence of violent destruction in the early 9th century. The monastery was burned and damaged in a way consistent with a raid by forces using metal weapons. The carved stones were smashed. The burning of the manuscript production buildings destroyed the vellum and the pigment stocks. The chronology of this destruction is consistent with the period of Viking raiding along the Scottish coastline in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. Iona, the monastery on the Inner Hebrides island, where Columba had established his community in 563 CE, was raided by the Vikings in 795, 802, and 806, with the killing of 68 of the community in the last attack. Port Mahomac may have suffered similarly in the same period. But the destruction of Port Mahomac is also part of a larger story about what happened to the Picts. In the mid-9th century, the Kingdom of the Picts and the Kingdom of Dalriada, the Gaelic-speaking kingdom founded by settlers from Ireland in the west of Scotland, merged under a single ruler. That ruler, Kenneth MacAlpin, is traditionally identified as the first king of Scotland, the man who unified the Picts and the Scots into a single political entity that became the kingdom that would eventually evolve into modern Scotland. Kenneth MacAlpin died in 858 CE. Within a generation or two of his death, the name Pictish had essentially disappeared from the written record. The kingdom is referred to as Alba. The language described in documents is Gaelic. The visual culture of the symbol stones gives way to the cross-slab tradition shared across the Gaelic world. What happened to the Picts? The question is one of the central mysteries of early Scottish history. One tradition, found in later medieval sources, says that Kenneth MacAlpin massacred the Pictish nobility at a great feast, using treachery to eliminate the leadership of a people he could not defeat in open battle. This tradition, which has the character of later legendary elaboration, suggests a hostile takeover, a conquest disguised as unification. Another interpretation sees the merger as genuinely a dynastic union, the coming together of two related cultures through intermarriage and inheritance rather than through conquest. The evidence for either interpretation is thin, because the sources are late, sparse, and tendentious. The genetic evidence for what happened to the Picts is more revealing than the written sources, though it too requires careful interpretation. The modern population of Scotland carries a genetic signature that shows deep continuity with the ancient populations of Britain. The dominant Y chromosome haplogroup in Scotland is R1b, the same haplogroup that characterizes most of Western and Northern Europe, and that was already present in Britain before the Roman period. There is also significant Norse input in the Northern Isles and the Western Isles, reflecting the Viking settlement of those areas in the 9th and 10th centuries. There is a Gaelic genetic component reflecting the settlement from Ireland associated with Dalriada. But beneath all of these layers, the genetic foundation of the Scottish population shows continuity with the pre-Roman Iron Age population of Scotland. What this means for the question of what happened to the Picts is that the Picts did not disappear in any demographic sense. The people did not die out. They were not replaced by an incoming population of Scots from Ireland. The genetic record shows that the people who were living in eastern and northern Scotland before the Dalriadic period continued living there after it. What changed was not the people. What changed was the cultural and political framework within which those people operated. The Pictish language ceased to be used. The Pictish symbol system ceased to be used. The Pictish royal dynasty was replaced. But the people who had developed those linguistic and cultural forms remained in place and gradually adopted the Gaelic language and the Gaelic cultural framework of the new Alba Kingdom. This pattern of cultural transformation without demographic replacement is one that archaeologists and historians have identified repeatedly in the early medieval period. It is what happened in much of the former Roman Empire after the 5th century, where the Latin-speaking Roman administrative class was replaced by Germanic-speaking warrior aristocracies, but the general population continued in place, eventually producing the medieval Romance languages as the outcome of Germanic and Vulgar Latin mixing over generations. In Scotland, the outcome of Pictish and Gaelic interaction over generations was a Gaelic-dominated culture that incorporated Pictish elements that can still be traced in place names, in genetic signatures, in certain artistic traditions, and perhaps in aspects of social structure. The place names of eastern Scotland are a palimpsest, a text written over and partially erased. Gaelic place names dominate the landscape, but under them are older strata visible to those who know where to look. Names beginning with pit, from a Pictish word meaning a piece of land or an estate, are concentrated in the Perthshire, Angus, and Fife areas, and extend into Aberdeenshire, Pitlochry, Pittenweem, Pitmedden, Pittodrie. These are Pictish place name elements incorporated into a Gaelic linguistic framework, compounds where the Pictish territorial word, pit, is followed by a Gaelic descriptive element. They are fossils, preserved in the landscape long after the language that produced them ceased to be spoken. The Wemyss Caves on the coast of Fife, overlooking the Firth of Forth, are a series of sea caves in the sandstone cliffs that contain one of the largest collections of Pictish carved symbols anywhere in Scotland. The caves were used for extended periods, and the symbols were carved into the cave walls at multiple points across the Pictish period. The concentration of symbols in these caves, in a location that was accessible from the sea, sheltered, and clearly marked as significant over a long period, suggests that the caves served a ritual or ceremonial function. They were not simply a convenient surface on which people scratched idle designs. They were a place where the symbol system was deployed deliberately and repeatedly in a context that was probably sacred. The problem with the Wemyss Caves is that they have been severely damaged. The sandstone is soft and the carved symbols are shallow, and they have been subject to vandalism, erosion, and the damage caused by the sea air over centuries. Some of the caves have collapsed. Some of the carvings that were recorded in the 19th century no longer exist. The caves are now a scheduled monument with restricted access, but the damage already done cannot be undone. The archive that those caves represented, whatever system of meaning was encoded in the accumulation of symbols on those walls, is partially and irreversibly lost. The Magel collection, housed in a converted schoolhouse in the village of Magel in Perthshire, is one of the richest assemblages of Pictish sculpture anywhere. There are 26 stones, ranging from recumbent grave markers to upright cross slabs of considerable height and elaboration. The range of subjects carved on the Magel stones includes animals, horsemen, hunting scenes, biblical figures, mythological creatures, and the standard Pictish symbol vocabulary. Stone number 2 at Magel, the largest, shows a biblical scene that has been interpreted as Daniel in the lion's den on one face, and a complex composition of horsemen, hunting, and mythological figures on the other. The skill and the ambition of the carving are immediately apparent. This was not local folk art. This was the product of a sophisticated workshop tradition with access to iconographic models from the wider Christian world, integrating them with native Pictish imagery in a synthesis that is distinctively and unmistakably its own. The question of where the Pictish artistic tradition came from and where it went is one that has occupied scholars for a long time. The interlaced knotwork on the Pictish cross slabs is directly related to the interlace that appears in the great insular manuscripts and in the Northumbrian stone carving tradition. The precise relationships are debated. Was the knotwork developed in Ireland and transmitted to Scotland? Was it developed in Northumbria and adopted by the Picts? Was it developed independently in several places from a common late antique Mediterranean source? The fact that the Hilton of Cadboll stone and the Aberlemno churchyard stone are as sophisticated as any contemporary European monument suggests that wherever the tradition came from, the Pictish craftsmen who worked in it were among its finest practitioners. Not its receivers, but its contributors. The Aberlemno stones deserve particular attention. They stand in the village of Aberlemno in Angus, 3 by the roadside and 1 in the churchyard, and they are among the finest examples of Pictish sculpture anywhere. The churchyard stone is especially significant. One face shows an elaborate cross with interlaced decoration. The other face shows a battle scene. There is an army in formation, with horsemen, infantry, and trumpeters. There are figures falling. There are birds of prey descending on the bodies of the fallen. The scene is sufficiently detailed that scholars have proposed it depicts a specific historical battle. The most widely accepted identification is that it shows the Battle of Nectansmere, fought in 685 CE, in which the Pictish king Brede mac Billy defeated the Northumbrian army of King Egfrith. The Battle of Nectansmere is one of the decisive engagements of early medieval Britain, and it is one of the most underappreciated. In the late 7th century, the Kingdom of Northumbria was the dominant power in northern Britain. It stretched from the Humber in the south to the Firth of Forth in the north, and its kings were ambitious. Ecgfrith of Northumbria, who came to power in 670 CE, was among the most aggressive. He had already campaigned in Ireland, which drew censure from the ecclesiastical leaders of his own time. In 685 CE, he pushed north into Pictland, leading an army into the territory of the Picts. Brede mac Billy, the Pictish king, did not meet Ecgfrith in open battle immediately. He drew the Northumbrian army north, into increasingly difficult terrain, into a landscape he knew and they did not. The name Nectansmere suggests a body of water, a mere, and the battle was fought in boggy, difficult ground near a loch in what is now Angus. The Northumbrian army was caught in unfavourable terrain and destroyed. Ecgfrith was killed. According to Bede, the Northumbrian monk and historian who wrote within a generation of the battle and who was deeply engaged with Northumbrian history, the Picts recovered all the territory that had been taken from them by the Northumbrians and their allies, and the power of the Northumbrian kingdom never fully recovered. Bede's account of Nectansmere is one of the most vivid passages in his ecclesiastical history of the English people. He describes how the rash king was led by a deceiving enemy into a narrow pass between mountains and into a loch, and was cut down with the greater part of his forces. He notes that the Angles who had previously inhabited the Pictish provinces were now either slaughtered or enslaved or forced to flee, and he reflects on the outcome in terms that make clear he understood its significance. He writes that from that day, the hopes and strength of the kingdom of Angles began to ebb and fall away. Bede understood that Nectansmere was not simply a military defeat. It was a turning point that permanently changed the balance of power in northern Britain. The stone at Aberlemno may be the memorial of that battle, carved within living memory of the event, showing the Northumbrian army in its moment of defeat. If the identification is correct, It is one of the very few secular historical narrative images to survive from early medieval Britain. It is not a biblical scene or a mythological composition. It is a depiction of a specific military event, the victory of the Pictish king over the Northumbrian enemy, carved in high relief on sandstone by craftsmen who may have known soldiers who had been on the field. The details of the scene, the specific equipment of the warriors, the arrangement of the forces, the postures of the fallen, were chosen by people who had information about the event itself. It is, in a sense, a monument to military power and political survival, carved in a visual language that no outsider could fully read. The connection between the Picts and the Antonine Wall is less often discussed than it should be. The Antonine Wall was the second Roman frontier in Britain, built in the 140 CE under the Emperor Antoninus Pius, running 40 miles from the Firth of Forth to the Firth of Clyde. It was built of turf on a stone base, with forts at regular intervals, and it was abandoned twice before the Romans finally pulled back permanently to Hadrian's Wall. The abandonment of the Antonine Wall, not once but twice, is among the most striking decisions in Roman frontier policy. Roman frontier systems were not usually abandoned. The Rhine and Danube frontiers were maintained for centuries. The British frontier, specifically the northern British frontier, required 2 withdrawals and the permanent adoption of the more southerly line. Why? The materials that have survived are thin on this point, but the archaeology gives some clues. The Antonine Wall was built in territory that had been subject to Roman military presence for half a century, territory that Rome had campaigned through and supposedly pacified. Yet within a generation of building the wall, Rome was pulling back. The people north of the Antonine Wall, the people who would later be called Picts, had demonstrated a capacity for sustained pressure against Roman positions that forced a recalculation. The fort at Tremontium, at a place now called Newstead near Melrose in the Scottish borders, is one of the most extensively excavated Roman sites in Scotland and one of the most revealing. It takes its name from the 3 peaks of Eildon Hill nearby, a prominent landmark visible for miles in all directions. Tremontium was occupied in multiple phases from the Flavian period through the late 2nd century, and it was one of the most elaborate and heavily defended Roman positions in Scotland. Excavations conducted in the late 19th century and supplemented since have recovered an extraordinary range of material, including weapons, equipment, horse harness, metalwork, pottery, and a collection of objects deposited in pits that may represent ritual deposits. The pits at Tremontium contained material that speaks to the pressure the fort was under. There are weapons, some deliberately broken or bent, that may represent military equipment destroyed to prevent capture rather than abandoned carelessly. There are collections of cavalry equipment of a quality that indicates the fort housed elite mounted units. There is a cavalry parade helmet of exceptional quality. And there are objects that came from far beyond the local area, including material of continental manufacture that reached Tremontium through Roman military supply chains. The scale of the investment represented by Tremontium, the quality of the material recovered, and the elaborate nature of the defences all indicate that this was a major military installation maintained at high cost. The repeated occupation and abandonment of Tremontium mirrors the broader pattern of Roman ambivalence about the north, the repeated pushing forward and pulling back that characterises the whole history of Roman engagement with Scotland. The brochs of Scotland, those extraordinary cylindrical stone towers that are unique to the country and cluster particularly densely in the northern and western Isles, have long been attributed to the Iron Age, to the centuries immediately before and after Roman contact. The conventional dating places most brochs in the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE, but recent radiocarbon dating of material from some brochs has pushed the dates of construction further back, with some examples now appearing to date from the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. The brochs are older than the Roman contact period, older than the period of Roman threat, and this complicates the once popular theory that they were built specifically as responses to Roman aggression. What the brochs represent is a tradition of architectural sophistication that had been developing in Scotland for centuries before Rome arrived. The construction of a broch, with its hollow wall technique, its internal staircase, its corbelled galleries, requires precise engineering knowledge and considerable skill in dry stone construction. The walls of the best brochs show a refined understanding of structural mechanics, with the double wall technique distributing load and maintaining height in ways that solid-walled structures of equivalent height could not have achieved. Musa Broch, in Shetland, still stands to a height of over 13 meters, the tallest surviving prehistoric drystone building in the world, and it stands without mortar, supported only by the skill with which the stones were selected, shaped, and placed. The broch builders did not exist in isolation. The distribution of brochs, along the coasts and in the island groups, indicates that their builders were a maritime people. The access to good stone, the maritime distribution, the internal consistency of the architectural tradition across a wide geographic area all suggest a connected network of communities linked by sea routes, sharing knowledge and skills, maintaining a tradition over multiple generations. The Romans, when they arrived, encountered this tradition already centuries old, already expressed in hundreds of stone towers of varying size and sophistication distributed along the coasts they were trying to survey. The Roman fort at Horia Classis, the fleet's granary, located at Cramond near Edinburgh, is a reminder that the Roman military engagement with Scotland was not purely a land operation. Cramond sat on the south bank of the Firth of Forth, providing a supply base where the fleet could support land operations further north. The logistics of Agricola's campaigns depended on sea supply. Moving enough food, equipment, and replacement material overland through hostile territory and difficult terrain to supply a campaigning army in Scotland would have been enormously costly and vulnerable. The fleet provided an alternative supply route, and the Roman investment in maritime support for the Scottish campaigns is evidence of how seriously they took the logistical challenge. The fleet's circumnavigation of Britain, described by Tacitus as one of Agricola's achievements, was a genuine feat of navigation and seamanship. Sailing around the northern tip of Scotland, through the waters where the Atlantic and the North Sea meet, past the headlands and through the tidal races, required knowledge of local conditions that the Romans could only have obtained from local informants. The fleet would have passed through waters that the broch-building communities of Orkney and Shetland knew intimately, waters where the currents and the winds and the rocks were part of everyday life for maritime peoples. Whether the Romans obtained pilots from among the local populations or whether they relied on their own navigational capabilities is not recorded. But the voyage itself, accomplished in Roman vessels that were not designed for the conditions of the North Atlantic, is a measure of Roman ambition and Roman capability. The communities that the fleet encountered on its circumnavigation were not passive observers. The maritime peoples of the Northern and Western Isles had their own long experience of sea travel, their own boats adapted to their waters, their own knowledge of currents and harbours and weather. They were not isolated. The archaeological evidence shows connections between the broch communities of Shetland and Orkney and those of the Scottish mainland, and there are traces of connections with the Irish and Welsh coasts. The Roman fleet arrived in waters where people already travelled, where there were already networks of communication and exchange, and where the appearance of a fleet of Roman warships would have been noted and communicated rapidly along those networks. What the people of the north thought of the Romans, what they understood of the empire that had arrived at the edges of their world, is almost entirely invisible in the record. We have the speech that Tacitus gives to Calgacus, but that speech is a Roman literary construction, not a Caledonian document. We have the objects that passed between the Roman world and the north, the coins and the brooches and the pottery, but objects do not carry the thoughts of those who owned them. We have the towers they built, the symbols they carved, the fortifications they maintained. We have the military responses they mounted. What we do not have is anything written in their own voice about their own experience of the encounter. There is one thing that we can read from the pattern of the evidence itself. The people of the north were paying attention. The hillforts of the later Iron Age in Scotland, the enclosed communities on defensible high ground, show signs of increased use and elaboration in the period of Roman contact. The brochs of the Northern Isles continue to be maintained and used. The metalwork tradition continues to produce objects of high quality. The communities of the north were not destabilized by Roman contact in the way that some communities in the south of Britain were destabilized. They adapted. They maintained their own practices. They continued to build, to carve, to forge, to organize. The vitrified forts raise a question that has not been fully answered. The number of vitrified forts, over 60, distributed across the highlands in the period before and during Roman contact, represents a very large investment in defensive infrastructure. The process of vitrifying a fort, whether accidental or deliberate, required fire of very high temperature sustained for a long period. If the vitrification was deliberate, it required the collection and burning of enormous quantities of fuel around or within the rampart structure. The effort is comparable to, or greater than, the effort of the original construction. Why would anyone do this? One theory is that vitrification was a deliberate act of destruction, carried out by enemies who burned the forts they captured. If a raiding force set fire to a timber-laced rampart and maintained that fire long enough, the stone would vitrify. This theory sees the vitrified forts as evidence of repeated cycles of conflict in which communities built fortifications, forts were captured and burned by enemies, new communities built on the same sites and vitrified the old remains, or enemies burned those too. The pattern of multiple vitrified forts in close proximity in some areas of the highlands might support this interpretation. Another theory is that vitrification was intentional, that communities deliberately fused their own ramparts to create a stronger and more permanent defensive structure. This theory has technical difficulties, because fusing a timber-laced rampart from the inside would destroy the timber before the stone could reach vitrification temperature, and fusing it from the outside would require creating a fire of enormous scale around the exterior of the wall. But the end product is undeniably stronger than an ordinary stone or earth rampart, and the consistency of the vitrified fort phenomenon across a wide area might indicate a deliberate tradition. The Rhynie complex in Aberdeenshire provides another window into the social complexity of pre-Pictish and early Pictish Scotland. Rhynie is a village in Upper Strathbogie, and around it are concentrated several exceptional Pictish symbol stones, including one of the most dramatic single images in all Pictish art. The Rhynie man is a stone carved with the figure of a tall, beaked figure carrying a weapon or implement. The figure is powerful, non-naturalistic, and clearly not a simple representation of an ordinary person. It has been interpreted as a deity, a shaman, a mythological figure, a specific type of religious specialist. Whatever it represents, it is one of the most compelling images to survive from the Pictish period, and its presence at Rhynie suggests that the area was a site of religious as well as political significance. Geophysical survey at Rhynie has identified a series of large enclosures, concentric ditched boundaries that surround the area of the symbol stone concentration. These enclosures, revealed by the magnetic anomalies they create in the subsoil, are not visible on the surface, and they have not been fully excavated. But their existence, and their association with the symbol stones, indicates that Rhynie was a major enclosed site, possibly a royal or religious centre, of a kind that elsewhere in early medieval Europe is associated with the ceremonial and political functions of elite communities. The combination of the large enclosures, the exceptional symbol stones, and the concentration of high-status material recovered from the area, including Pictish metalwork of fine quality, makes Rhynie one of the most significant Pictish sites in Scotland and one of the least known outside specialist circles. Forteviot, in Perthshire, was identified through a combination of geophysical survey and aerial photography as the site of a major Pictish royal palace. Historical sources name Forteviot as a royal seat of the later Pictish and early Scottish kingdoms. Kenneth MacAlpin is said to have died there. The geophysical surveys have revealed a complex of large timber buildings, enclosures, and ceremonial structures covering a substantial area, consistent with the identification of a high-status royal site of the 8th or 9th century. The evidence for elaborate timber architecture at Forteviot is significant because the timber buildings of early medieval Scotland have left almost no above-ground trace, and the reconstruction of Pictish royal centres has been difficult. Forteviot begins to fill that gap. There is a class of monuments called souterrains, or earth houses, or fogus in Cornwall, that appear in large numbers in Scotland, particularly in the eastern lowlands and in the northeast. They are underground stone-lined passages, sometimes single chambers, and sometimes elaborate branching systems, attached to surface settlements and apparently used for storage. The conventional explanation is that they were food stores, designed to take advantage of the stable low temperatures underground to preserve perishable goods. This explanation is certainly partly correct. The underground temperature in a souterrain would remain consistently cool through the year, ideal for preserving dairy products and other foods that spoil quickly in warm conditions. But the souterrains of Scotland raise questions that the simple storage explanation does not fully address. Some of them are remarkably large, running for tens of meters, with corbelled roofs and carefully built stone walls. The investment of labor in constructing a souterrain of this scale exceeds what would be required for simple food storage purposes. Some souterrains are oriented in ways that suggest deliberate relationship to the cardinal directions or to solar and lunar events, with entrance passages aligned to allow light to penetrate at specific times of year. Some souterrains have multiple chambers with different construction characteristics, suggesting that they were used for different purposes or were modified over time. The possibility that souterrains served ritual as well as practical functions has been explored but not resolved. The underground space, the passage from the surface world down into the earth, the darkness and the silence, are conditions that in many cultures are associated with ritual activity, with the underworld, with the ancestors. The deliberate construction of underground passages in communities that had both the knowledge and the resources to build above-ground structures of considerable scale may indicate that the underground had significance beyond the collar, practical. The Pictish language is one of the deepest mysteries in the whole Pictish complex, and it deserves extended consideration. The question of what language the Picts spoke was already debated in the early medieval period. Modern scholarship has largely converged on the view that the Picts spoke a Celtic language, specifically a P-Celtic or Brittonic language related to Welsh and Cornish rather than to Irish and Scottish Gaelic, which are Q-Celtic. The evidence for this comes from place names and from the fragmentary glosses and personal names recorded in the Irish sources. P-Celtic place names of a type consistent with the Brittonic branch of Celtic are found in the distribution areas of the Picts. But there is also evidence that something else was going on. The Pictish Ogham inscriptions, those short texts in the Irish Ogham script, applied to a language that cannot be read as any known Celtic tongue, have been the source of persistent scholarly puzzlement. If the Picts spoke a Brittonic Celtic language that can be broadly reconstructed from place names, why are the Ogham inscriptions in something that does not look like Brittonic Celtic? One hypothesis is that there were two registers of Pictish, a vernacular Brittonic Celtic and a different, possibly older, ritual or administrative language used in formal contexts and encoded in the Ogham inscriptions. This hypothesis remains speculative, but it is consistent with the pattern of the evidence. The alternative hypothesis, that the language encoded in the Pictish Ogham inscriptions is a non-Indo-European language, a survivor of pre-Celtic linguistic traditions in Scotland, has attracted serious scholarly attention and serious scholarly skepticism in roughly equal measure. Pre-Celtic populations certainly existed in Britain and Ireland before the spread of Celtic languages in the Bronze and Iron Ages. Whatever they spoke before Celtic arrived is as completely unknown as the Pictish Ogham language. The possibility that a non-Celtic language survived in some form in the north of Scotland long after Celtic had replaced it elsewhere in Britain is not inherently impossible. Basque survives in the Pyrenees as the last remnant of pre-Indo-European languages in Western Europe. But the evidence for this hypothesis in the Pictish case is not sufficient to constitute proof. What is certain is that the Picts used language in complex and sophisticated ways. The king lists, the genealogical traditions, the personal names recorded in Irish and Northumbrian sources all attest to an elaborate culture of oral tradition. Complex societies maintain complex oral cultures, and the Picts are no exception. The poet's role in early medieval Celtic societies, the maintenance and transmission of genealogy, lore, and historical tradition through trained memory, is well attested in Irish and Welsh sources. The Picts would almost certainly have had equivalent practitioners, specialists in the preservation and performance of the social memory that every complex society requires. None of their compositions survive, because they were not written down in the Pictish period, and after the cultural transition to Gaelic in the 9th century, whatever Pictish oral tradition had been maintained ceased to be transmitted. The disappearance of the Pictish language is in some ways the most complete loss associated with the Pictish period. Other things have survived. The symbol stones are still standing, the metalwork is in museums, the place names are still on the maps. But the language, the medium through which the Picts understood and described their own world, is gone. We have a handful of personal names. We have the place name elements. We have the Ogham inscriptions that cannot be read. And we have the names of the kings, transmitted through the king lists. Everything else that the Picts said to each other, the stories they told, the laws they maintained, the prayers they offered, the songs they sang, is inaccessible. The Votadini deserve more attention than they usually receive in the history of Roman Scotland, because their story illuminates the range of possible relationships between the northern peoples and Rome. The Votadini occupied the territory of the modern Lothians and Borders, the area between the Firth of Forth and the English border that is now the most densely populated part of Scotland. Their main centre was at Traprain Law, the hill fort in East Lothian where the silver hoard was found, and the archaeological evidence suggests that Traprain Law was occupied continuously from the Bronze Age through the early post-Roman period. What distinguishes the Votadini from the other tribes of the north is the nature of their relationship with Rome. While the Caledonii and the other northern tribes maintained a relationship of sustained resistance to Roman expansion, the Votadini appear to have adopted a more complex, accommodating posture. The Traprain Law hoard, whatever its exact origin, indicates that the Votadini were receiving Roman silver in large quantities. The Roman material at Traprain Law is not the same as the Roman material found scattered at sites across the Highland zone. It is more concentrated, of higher quality, and appears in contexts suggesting deliberate acquisition rather than incidental trade contact. The Votadini may have functioned as a Roman client state, a buffer entity on the northern edge of the Roman province, whose cooperation was secured through diplomatic gifts and whose presence provided a zone of relative stability between the Roman province and the hostile north. If the Votadini were Roman clients, they were an independent-minded and eventually successful kind of client. After Roman power in Britain collapsed in the 5th century, the Votadini emerge in the sources under the Brittonic name Gododin as the subjects of one of the great elegiac poems of the early medieval period. The poem Why Gododin, attributed to the 6th century poet Aneurin, describes a raid by Gododin warriors from Edinburgh south to Catterick in Yorkshire and their defeat and death there. The poem is a memorial of the fallen, celebrating the courage and generosity of warriors who died in a failed enterprise, and it is one of the earliest extended poems in any British language. The Gododin, the heirs of the Votadini, and the former Roman clients were still here, still fighting, still generating culture, over a century after the last Roman soldier left Britain. The cross-slab tradition that produced the greatest Pictish monuments of the 8th and 9th centuries represents a synthesis that is worth pausing over. The early Pictish symbol stones, the Class 1 stones as they are classified in the conventional typology, are simple. They are natural boulders or roughly shaped slabs with symbols incised directly into the stone, without any cross or Christian imagery. The Class 2 stones add a cross, usually a ringed cross of Celtic type, to the symbol repertoire, combining Christian and pre-Christian symbolism on the same surface. The Class 3 stones abandon the traditional symbols and show only the cross and Christian imagery. This progression, from purely Pictish symbol stones to Christian cross slabs, maps onto the Christianization of Pictish society. The Picts encountered Christianity through multiple routes. There was the figure of Ninian, who, according to later tradition, established a Christian community at Wythorn in Galloway in the late 4th or early 5th century, and whose influence may have reached the south of Pictland. There was Columba, who arrived at Iona in 563 CE, and who, according to a Domnan's biography, travelled into Pictland and had encounters with the Pictish king Bride mac Malchon. Whether Columba's visit to Pictland had significant missionary effect is debated, but the Irish monastic tradition that Columba represented certainly reached Pictland in the following century. And there was Northumbrian Christianity, transmitted north from the Anglican Church. What the Picts did with Christianity was characteristically their own. They did not simply adopt an imported framework and discard their existing visual and symbolic culture. They integrated. The Class 2 stones show the Christian cross in combination with Pictish symbols that may have retained their original meanings or may have been given new Christian interpretations. The interlaced knotwork of the cross slabs is related to but distinct from Irish and Northumbrian models, showing consistent local development of a shared tradition. The figural scenes on the later cross slabs draw on biblical iconography but combine it with hunting scenes, warrior scenes, and mythological images from the Pictish cultural world. This synthesis, this integration of incoming cultural material with existing indigenous traditions, is a mark of a society that was confident enough in its own identity to absorb new elements without being overwhelmed by them. The Picts did not become Roman in the period of Roman contact. They adopted Roman goods and perhaps some Roman practices while maintaining the core of their own cultural identity. They did not become simple imitators of Irish Christianity. They created a distinctive Pictish Christian tradition that drew on Irish, Northumbrian, and Mediterranean models and transformed them into something recognizably Pictish. The monuments that tradition produced are among the finest surviving artifacts of early medieval Europe. The Suenos stone, standing at Forres in Moray, is the largest Pictish carved monument in Scotland, nearly 7 meters tall. One face shows an elaborate cross with knotwork decoration. The other face is completely covered with a narrative scene of extraordinary density. There are rows of warriors, horses, trumpeters, warriors in combat, the aftermath of battle with decapitated bodies and headless trunks, a formal meeting or submission scene at the top. The stone appears to be depicting a major military event, a battle and its aftermath, in a visual narrative that covers the entire height of a 7-meter slab. The event depicted has not been identified with certainty, but the scale of the monument and the detail of the scene indicate that this was an event of enormous importance, commemorated with the greatest possible visual and material investment. The fact that we cannot identify the event depicted on Suenos stone is a reminder of how much Pictish history has been lost. The stone was carved to commemorate something that everyone who saw it in its original context would have recognized. The people who built it did not need to label it. The story was known. It was only when the context of knowledge that supported that recognition was lost, when the Pictish cultural tradition ceased to be maintained and transmitted, that the stone became a mystery. The mystery is not in the stone. The mystery is in the loss. The question of what the Picts knew about their own past is one that the evidence cannot answer directly. But the king lists, the genealogies, the place names, the monuments, the artistic traditions, all indicate a society with a robust sense of its own history and a sophisticated apparatus for maintaining and transmitting historical memory. The king lists claim royal succession going back many generations. The place names encode information about the landscape and its history. The symbol stones, whatever exactly they mean, encode information that their makers expected future generations to be able to read. These are the marks of a society that valued its own past and invested in the transmission of knowledge about that past. The Roman encounter with this society was significant in ways that neither party could fully have anticipated. Rome brought iron discipline, engineering knowledge, and military organization that was without parallel in the ancient world. The people of northern Scotland brought intimate knowledge of terrain, sustained political cohesion across tribal units in the face of external threat, and a military flexibility that the Roman army, designed for different kinds of warfare, could not fully counter. The outcome of that encounter was not the Roman conquest of Scotland. It was the Roman decision, repeated and ultimately permanent, not to attempt that conquest. That decision shaped everything that followed. Because the Romans did not conquer Scotland, the people of Scotland were not Romanized in the way that the people of southern England, France, Spain, or the Rhine provinces were Romanized. They did not adopt Latin as an administrative language. They did not build Roman-style cities. They did not integrate into the Roman tax and legal system. They maintained their own institutions, their own laws, their own social structures, their own languages. And when Rome fell, as it fell in the 5th century, the people of Scotland had institutions that were not dependent on the Roman framework and that continued to function without it. The contrast with southern Britain is instructive. The Roman withdrawal from Britain in the early 5th century left a population that had been deeply Romanized for 4 centuries, that had built its cities on Roman models, administered through Roman law, communicated in Latin. When the Roman administrative apparatus was removed, the population of southern Britain had difficulty maintaining the urban and agricultural infrastructure it had inherited. The great villa estates went out of use. The towns shrank. The roads began to deteriorate. The long-distance trade networks collapsed. Southern Britain in the 5th century shows the archaeological signature of economic and social contraction. Northern Britain, Scotland, shows no such contraction. There was no Roman infrastructure to lose. The hillforts, the brochs, the agricultural villages, the networks of kinship and obligation that organized society, continued without interruption. The 5th century was politically turbulent, as the power vacuum left by Roman withdrawal attracted Scots from Ireland angles from across the North Sea, and produced ongoing competition among the existing kingdoms. But the social fabric of northern Scotland was not disrupted by the end of Rome in the way that southern British society was disrupted. The Picts, who had spent 3 centuries maintaining their independence against Roman pressure, found themselves in the post-Roman world as one of the stronger political entities in Britain, with institutions that worked and with no experience of the kind of dependency on external structures that left southern Britain so vulnerable. The Pictish symbol system may have served functions analogous to those served by writing in other cultures, but without being writing in the strict sense. The symbols appear on a limited range of objects and surfaces, including stones, metalwork, bone, cave walls. They do not appear on clay tablets, papyrus, or any of the surfaces used by literate cultures for administrative and commercial record-keeping. This suggests that the symbols were not used for the kind of everyday documentation that writing enables, but rather for a more restricted set of purposes associated with identity, status, commemoration, and perhaps religious practice. The closest parallel that has been proposed is to the heraldic systems of medieval Europe, where a defined set of symbols in a defined set of combinations identified noble lineages and was deployed on their properties, their banners, their seals, and their monuments. The Pictish symbols appear on stones that were placed at significant locations, often associated with burial or with boundaries, and on metalwork worn by high-status individuals. The mirror and comb symbol that frequently appears on Pictish stones has been interpreted as a female gender marker, suggesting that it identified the monuments of high-status women. If this interpretation is correct, then the symbol system was at least partially a system of personal and genealogical identification, used to mark who was commemorated or who held authority at a particular location. The systematic distribution of specific symbol combinations across the entire Pictish area implies a degree of central coordination or shared convention that goes beyond what a purely local tradition of decoration could produce. The same symbols, in the same forms, appear in Shetland and in Fife, hundreds of kilometers apart. This consistency could be maintained by a system of trained specialists who knew the complete repertoire and applied it correctly wherever they worked. It could also be maintained by the circulation of objects bearing the symbols, which could serve as models for new carvings in different locations. Or it could be maintained by a political or social structure in which the symbols were part of the operating system of governance, as it were, used in contexts where precise adherence to standard forms was necessary. The Pictish Church, which developed in the 7th and 8th centuries and produced the great monuments, was also a vehicle for the transmission of symbolic and artistic conventions across the Pictish kingdom. The monastic network, with its interconnections between communities at Port Mahomac, at Iona, at Lindisfarne in Northumbria, and at continental centres, was a system for moving people, knowledge, and exemplars across large distances. A craftsman trained at one centre could carry knowledge of motifs and techniques to another, and the cross slabs that appeared across the Pictish kingdom in the 8th century represent the output of interconnected workshops, drawing on shared resources and producing work in recognizable common traditions while adapting them to local materials and patrons. The Easter Achorthes recumbent stone circle in Aberdeenshire is one of the best preserved examples of a monument type that is almost entirely confined to northeastern Scotland. Recumbent stone circles have a massive horizontal stone. The recumbent, flanked by the 2 tallest uprights in the circle, placed in the southwest arc of the ring. The recumbent is always the largest stone in the circle. At Easter Achorthes, the recumbent is a massive piece of pinkish granite that is visually striking against the grey of the flankers. The stones of the circle were clearly selected for visual effect as well as for their size, and the whole composition has a monumental authority that is immediately impressive even today. The alignment of recumbent stone circles toward the south-southwest and the position of the recumbent in the southwest arc has led to the observation that this is the direction in which the full moon sets at its southernmost declination, the major southern standstill of the lunar cycle that occurs once every 18.6 years. This connection between the recumbent stone circle tradition and the major lunar standstill is consistent with what is known about other Scottish stone monuments, including the Callanish stones in Lewis. It suggests a sophisticated understanding of the lunar cycle among the communities who built these monuments, and the use of monumental architecture to mark and celebrate the observable patterns of the sky. The communities that built Easter Achorthes were not the Picts. The recumbent stone circles date from the Neolithic and early Bronze Age, roughly 3000 to 2000 BCE, predating the Iron Age communities that the Romans encountered by 2 millennia. But they are in the same landscape. They sit in the same fields that Pictish farmers cultivated. They were visible to the people who carved the symbol stones in Aberdeenshire. What the Pictish communities made of the ancient monuments in their landscape, whether they maintained traditions about them or used them in their own rituals or simply farmed around them, cannot be directly known. But the continuity of landscape across deep time is a reminder that the Picts were themselves heirs to thousands of years of occupation and cultural development in the same territory. The Tomnaveri recumbent stone circle, also in Aberdeenshire, overlooks the How of Cromer, a broad valley enclosed by hills, and the circle is positioned to frame a view toward the hills in a way that appears deliberate. Standing inside the circle and looking across the recumbent toward the surrounding landscape, the relationship between the monument and its topographic context becomes apparent. These monuments were not just arrangements of stones. They were interfaces between the human community and the landscape, positioned to make visible the relationships between the built environment and the natural world that the builders considered significant. The deep time of Scottish history, from the first arrival of human communities after the ice retreated through the Mesolithic, Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age, Roman contact period, Pictish period, and beyond, represents one of the longest continuous records of human habitation in northern Europe. The landscape of Scotland is a palimpsest in which the marks of every period are still visible to those who look. The standing stones of the Neolithic, the hillforts of the Iron Age, the symbol stones of the Picts, the place names in Pictish and Gaelic and Norse, the field systems of every agricultural period, all overlay each other in a record that is still being read and will be read for centuries to come. The civilization that terrified the Romans was not a sudden creation. It was the product of thousands of years of development in one of the most demanding and rewarding landscapes in the world. The people who faced Agricola's legions at Mons Graupius in 83 CE had been accumulating knowledge of their landscape, their climate, their resources, their neighbours, and their enemies for hundreds of generations. They had built the hillforts and the brochs. They had developed the metalwork tradition. They had maintained the networks of kinship and obligation that held the confederation together. They had learned the military tactics appropriate to their terrain. And when the most powerful military organization in the ancient world arrived at the edge of their world and began pushing north, they pushed back. And the most powerful military organization in the ancient world decided, eventually, that the cost of pushing back against them was not worth paying. The Roman calculation about Scotland was not simply a matter of military inability. The Romans were perfectly capable of maintaining a frontier in Scotland if they had decided that the strategic and economic value of doing so was sufficient. The question was whether it was worth it. And the answer they kept arriving at was no. Part of that answer was the cost of the ongoing military presence in the face of sustained guerrilla resistance. Part of it was the limited economic value of the Scottish Highlands, which did not offer the agricultural wealth, the mineral resources, or the commercial opportunities that justified the expense of garrisoning it. And part of it was the nature of the opposition itself, which did not respond to the standard Roman methods of pacification. The standard Roman methods of pacification worked by capturing the political and economic centres of a society, making the ruling class dependent on Rome, and using the existing social hierarchy as a vehicle for Roman administration. In Gaul, in Spain, in Britain south of the Forth, this approach worked. The tribal aristocracy of southern Britain was integrated into the Roman system. They built villas in the Roman style. They used Latin in their inscriptions. They adopted Roman religion alongside their own. They served in Roman administrative roles. They became, in the course of a few generations, Roman Britons rather than simply Britons. The tribal societies of the north were structured in ways that made this approach much more difficult. The kinship networks that held the northern tribes together were distributed across the landscape in ways that did not lend themselves to the capture-the-center strategy. There was no single center to capture. The political authority of the chieftains and kings of the north was embedded in personal relationships and genealogical obligations that could not be neutralized by killing or capturing one individual. When one leader fell, another rose. When one community was defeated, the network of relationships that connected it to other communities meant that the fight continued from elsewhere. The Roman writers who described the Caledonians emphasized their ferocity, their endurance, their love of freedom. These are the standard topoi of Roman descriptions of northern barbarians, and they need to be read critically. But embedded in these descriptions are details that correspond to the archaeological evidence. The Caledonians, Tacitus, and Dio Cassius note, were accustomed to living in the open, to enduring cold and hunger, to swimming in rivers. They moved through terrain that slowed the Roman army. They used tactics suited to that terrain. They struck and withdrew. They avoided the set-piece battles that would have favored Roman discipline and organization. When forced into a set-piece engagement, as at Mons Graupius, they lost. But the aftermath of Mons Graupius demonstrated that losing a battle did not mean losing the war. Dio Cassius, writing in the early 3rd century about the campaigns of the Emperor Septimius Severus in Scotland in 208 to 211 CE, provides one of the most vivid descriptions of guerrilla warfare against the Roman army in the entire ancient record. Severus invaded Scotland in force, with an army of between 40,000 and 70,000 men, one of the largest Roman military forces ever assembled in Britain. The campaign lasted 3 years and cost an enormous number of casualties. Dio describes how the Caledonians and their allies drew the Romans into ambushes, how they feigned retreat and then struck, how they used their knowledge of the terrain to maximum effect, how they picked off Roman foraging parties and stragglers in the forests and marshes. He reports that Severus lost 50,000 men in the campaign. This number is almost certainly exaggerated, as ancient casualty figures almost always are, but the direction of the report is clear. The Scottish campaigns of Severus were enormously costly and did not achieve permanent results. Severus died at York in 211 CE while preparing a new campaign, and his son Caracalla immediately made peace with the Maetae and the Caledonii, the 2 main confederations in the north at that period, restored prisoners, and withdrew. The withdrawal after Severus is the last major Roman military operation in Scotland. After 211 CE, Rome maintained its presence behind Hadrian's wall, and the north of Britain remained outside the empire permanently. The century and a half of intermittent Roman military engagement with Scotland, from Agricola in the 70 SCE to Severus in the 200 SCE, ended in a definitive recognition that the north was not a viable target for Roman conquest. The memory of Rome in the Scottish landscape is extensive. There are over 1,000 known Roman sites in Scotland, ranging from the great frontier works to temporary marching camps used by campaigning armies for a single night. The marching camps are particularly illuminating. A Roman marching camp was built fresh every evening by the army on the march, following a standard design with a defensive ditch and rampart, enclosing the standard arrangement of tents. The remains of these camps can still be traced in the Scottish landscape as crop marks visible from the air. The distribution of marching camps traces the routes of Roman armies through Scotland, and the northernmost examples, in Aberdeenshire, mark the furthest extent of Roman military penetration. Some of the marching camps in Scotland are enormous. The camp at Wython Wells in Aberdeenshire covers an area sufficient for a force of perhaps 40 to 50,000 men, consistent with the scale of the Severn campaign. The camp at Durno, also in Aberdeenshire, and close to Benachie, a prominent hill in the northeast, has been proposed as the site of the Roman camp immediately before the Battle of Mons Graupius, on the basis of its size and its position relative to the landscape. If Durno is the Mons Graupius camp, then the battle was fought in the shadow of Benachie, on the slopes of a mountain that still dominates the northeastern skyline, and the Caledonian army was drawn up on those slopes, watching the Roman army deploy in the valley below. The view from Benachie is extraordinary. On a clear day, much of Aberdeenshire is visible from the summit, from the Moray Firth in the north to the Highland Massif in the west. The people who lived in that landscape and who stood on that hill knew every feature of the terrain below them. They knew where the rivers ran and where they could be crossed. They knew where the ground was firm and where it was boggy. They knew where the forests provided cover and where the open ground favoured a conventional formation. The Roman army, campaigning in foreign territory with whatever local intelligence it had managed to gather, was in a fundamentally different epistemic situation. The Romans had maps, the finest cartographic tradition in the ancient world, But even the best map is not the same as a lifetime of walking a landscape. This asymmetry of knowledge, the deep familiarity of the defenders with their own ground against the essential foreignness of the invaders, is one of the constants of the Scottish resistance to Rome. It explains the effectiveness of the guerrilla tactics that Dio Cassius describes for the Severan campaign. It explains why the Roman army, the finest military instrument of the ancient world, could not simply sweep through Scotland the way it had swept through Gaul or Spain or the Danube provinces. The landscape itself was an ally of the defenders, and the defenders knew how to use it. The relationship between the Picts and the sea is one of the aspects of their civilization that the evidence addresses most clearly, and that the popular image of the Picts tends to underemphasize. The Pictish kingdom, at its height, controlled most of the coastline of eastern Scotland, from the Firth of Forth to the Moray Firth, and beyond, including the coastline of Caithness and the Orkney Islands. The distribution of Pictish symbol stones in Orkney and Shetland demonstrates that the Pictish cultural and probably political sphere extended across the seas to the Northern Isles. Maritime control in the early medieval period was military power, the ability to move forces rapidly by sea, to strike along a coastline and withdraw before a response could be mounted, and to control the fishing and trade routes that ran along that coastline, was a source of enormous strategic advantage. The Pictish kingdom's possession of the eastern Scottish coastline meant that it controlled the approach routes to the Moray Firth, the Cromarty Firth, the Bowley Firth, and the other deep inlets that penetrated the Highland Massif. Any enemy approaching from the south or from the sea had to reckon with a maritime dimension to Pictish power that added complexity to any purely land-based strategic calculation. The Picts in Orkney are attested by the symbol stones found there, but also by the brochs. The broch-building tradition in Orkney predates the Pictish period proper, but the continuity of occupation in Orcadian brochs into the Pictish period, and the presence of Pictish material culture in Orkney, indicates that the relationship between Orkney and the Pictish kingdom was sustained over centuries. The Norse settlement of Orkney in the 9th century, which is so densely documented in the sagas and in Norse place names that the Orcadian place name map is overwhelmingly Norse, replaced a Pictish Orcadian culture whose own name for the islands is not preserved. The place name record of Orkney is among the most complete erasures of any predecessor culture in the British Isles. The Norse, who settled Orkney, brought their own names for everything, and almost nothing of the Pictish Orcadian naming tradition survived. The Picts were not passive victims of Viking expansion. Before the Norse settlement, the Picts had been among the most active maritime powers in northern Britain, and the raids that the Norse conducted on the Scottish and Irish coasts in the late 8th century were met with Pictish military response as well as ecclesiastical lament. The destruction of Port Mahomac that the excavations record is the permanent record of one of those encounters. But the Pictish kingdom also, in this period, was engaged in complex political relationships with the Gaelic kingdom of Dalriada to the west, and it was out of those relationships that the kingdom of Alba eventually emerged. The Dalriadic Scots, Gaelic speakers from Ireland who had established themselves in Argyll and the Western Isles, were a consistent presence on the western edge of Pictland. At various points in the 7th and 8th centuries, the relationship between the Picts and the Scots was one of conflict, at other points of cooperation or intermarriage. There are Pictish kings in the king lists whose names are Gaelic, indicating intermarriage between the two royal dynasties. There are Dalriadic kings who appear to have exercised overlordship over Pictish territory at certain periods, and Pictish kings who appear to have extended their authority over Dalriadic territory. The merger of the two kingdoms in the mid-9th century under Kenneth MacAlpin was the culmination of a process of dynastic entanglement that had been going on for generations. The church was a major vehicle for the cultural integration that preceded the political merger. The Columban Church, founded by Columba at Iona in 563 CE and extending through a network of daughter houses across Scotland and Ireland, operated across the Pict-Scot boundary. The monastery at Port Mahomac was in Pictland, but it was participating in the same manuscript tradition as Iona and the Irish monasteries. The ecclesiastical network created connections across political boundaries and provided a framework within which Pictish and Gaelic cultural elements could interact and mix. The synthesis, evident in the great Pictish cross slabs, with their combination of native and Irish-influenced elements, reflects this broader process of cultural mixing within a shared Christian community. The question of how the Pictish language disappeared is one that intersects with the question of how language shift happens in general. Language shift, the adoption of a new language by a community that had previously spoken a different one, requires not coercion but prestige and utility. If Gaelic was the language of the royal court, of the church, of trade, and of administrative record-keeping in the Kingdom of Alba, then adopting Gaelic would have been the rational response of Pictish communities seeking to participate in those spheres. The mechanism of language shift is not necessarily violent. It is often the adoption of the language of opportunity by communities that continue to use their own language in domestic and local contexts while using the prestige language in wider contexts, until the domestic use also shifts. This process would have taken generations, and its progress was uneven. Place names in the Pit tradition, which are found in areas that appear to have been Pictish-speaking into the 10th century or later, suggest that Pictish persisted in some areas long after the political merger. The Pit compounds, with their Pictish territorial element followed by Gaelic descriptive elements, represent a stage of language contact in which Pictish speakers were acquiring Gaelic vocabulary and integrating it into their existing naming conventions, before eventually adopting Gaelic wholesale. The Pictish king list tradition continued into the Kingdom of Alba, and the kings of Alba maintained claims to Pictish genealogical legitimacy. Kenneth MacAlpin himself is presented in some sources as having a Pictish mother, which would have given him a claim to the Pictish throne through the matrilineal succession that the Picts appear to have used. Whether this matrilineal element is historical or a later legendary construction designed to legitimize the Alba dynasty's Pictish claims is debated. But the fact that such legitimization was considered necessary indicates that the Pictish identity retained importance even after the political merger. The Alba kings were not simply replacing the Picts, they were claiming to be their heirs. That claim, the claim to be the heirs of the ancient people of the north, carries an echo that reaches across more than a millennium to the present. The Picts are the most remote ancestors of the modern Scottish population, who can be identified with any precision. They are the people who held the north of Britain against the Roman Empire, who carved the mysterious symbols on the standing stones, who fought at Nectansmere and stopped the Northumbrian advance, who built the monastery at Portmahomac and produced the great cross slabs. They are the people before the Scots, and they are also, in a very real demographic sense, the Scots themselves, the population that remained in place through all the political and cultural transitions of the early medieval period, and that provided the human foundation of everything that came after. The Selgovae, who occupied the uplands of the modern Scottish borders, and the Novante, who held Galloway in the southwest, are among the most obscure of the northern tribes, and their obscurity is in itself interesting. The Romans interacted with them primarily through the military campaigns in the borders region, which were extensive, and through the diplomatic relationships that developed along the frontier. The Novante occupied a peninsula pointing toward Ireland, and their relationship with Irish communities across the water was probably as important to them as their relationship with Rome to the south. The Selgovae, in the uplands, were likely skilled at the kind of dispersed mobile warfare that made the whole northern frontier so difficult. What happened to the Selgovae and the Novante in the post-Roman period is not recorded in any source. They do not appear by name after the Roman period ends. The territories they occupied became part of the Kingdom of Reged, one of the successor kingdoms of the post-Roman north, and later of the Strathclyde Kingdom and Northumbria. The people continued, as they always had. The tribal names faded from the record as the political frameworks changed. The descendants of the Selgovae are among the ancestors of the border communities of the medieval and modern periods, people whose connection to the landscape of the upland borders goes back not just to the medieval period, but to the Iron Age and beyond. The Damnonii of the Clyde Valley represent another piece of this complex picture. The Clyde was a major route into the interior of Scotland, and the communities who controlled the Clyde Valley controlled access to the northwest highlands. The hillforts on the volcanic rocks of the Clyde Valley, particularly at Dumbarton Rock and at the high ground overlooking the river crossings, were strategic positions of considerable importance. In the post-Roman period, the Damnonii territory became the core of the Kingdom of Strathclyde, one of the most durable kingdoms in early medieval Britain, persisting as a political entity until the 11th century. the British-speaking population of Strathclyde maintained a Brittonic identity long after the surrounding areas had adopted Gaelic or English. The connection between the various British kingdoms of the post-Roman North, Riged, Strathclyde, the Gododin, and the Pictish kingdom, is complex and not fully mapped. They spoke related but distinct variants of Brittonic. They shared the tradition of the praise poetry in which the deeds of warriors and kings were commemorated, the tradition that produced Y Gododin. They interacted through warfare, alliance, and intermarriage. And they were all eventually absorbed into the Scottish kingdom of Alba or into English Northumbria, but the absorption was a long process and in some areas a very late one. The island of Bute, in the Firth of Clyde, was the site of Rothesay Castle and has a long history of occupation. But before the medieval castle there was a prehistoric fort, and before that the island lay at the intersection of the maritime routes of the Firth of Clyde, accessible from the mainland on several sides. The communities who occupied the island were in contact with the Damnonii to the north, with the communities of Ayrshire to the east, and through the sea lanes with Arran, Kintyre, and the Irish coast. The western seaways were a highway in the early medieval period, and Bute sat on that highway. The place name evidence for the pre-Gaelic inhabitants of the western seaways is thin but suggestive. Some place names in Kintyre and the Southern Isles appear to preserve Brittonic elements older than the Gaelic period of Dalriada. The substrate of place names in western Scotland is not fully analysed, and the task of distinguishing early Gaelic from Brittonic, from even older naming traditions, is difficult when the surviving forms have been through centuries of Gaelic phonological change. But the effort continues, and each year's place name research adds detail to the picture of a multilingual and culturally complex Western Scotland long before the historical record begins to give us usable detail. The Ardnamurchan Peninsula, the westernmost point of the British mainland, that was the site of an excavated Norse boat burial, discovered in 2011, that was the first complete Viking boat burial to be excavated in Scotland for over a century. The burial contained the remains of a man with a Norse sword, a spear, a shield, arrows, a knife, a whetstone, a ladle, drinking horn fittings, and other objects. The boat itself was preserved only as a shadow in the soil, the outline of the iron rivets that had once held its planks together. This burial, in the period of Norse settlement, was placed in a landscape that had been inhabited and meaningful to previous communities for thousands of years. The Norse, who buried their man on Ardnamurchan, were not placing him in empty ground. They were placing him in a landscape already dense with human meaning. What the Norse encountered when they came to Scotland was a civilization of considerable depth and sophistication. The monasteries they raided were among the most productive centres of manuscript culture in northwestern Europe. The hillforts they may have occupied were structures with centuries of history. The field systems they farmed had been worked for generations. The symbol stones they built walls around or converted into floor slabs in their own structures were monuments of a tradition they did not understand, but that represented the accumulated cultural investment of many lifetimes. The Norse were vigorous, skilled, and ultimately transformative in their impact on Scotland, but they were not arriving at a blank slate. The long view of Scottish history before the Scots, the history of the Caledonii and the Picts and the Votadini and the Damnonii and the Gododin, is a history of people who developed sophisticated cultures in a demanding landscape, who resisted the most powerful military force the ancient world produced, who maintained complex social and political institutions across many centuries, and who ultimately were absorbed into new political frameworks without disappearing as a people. Their descendants are still here. The DNA that traces back to the Iron Age populations of Scotland is still present in the modern Scottish population. The place names they gave the landscape are still in use. The standing stones they built or inherited are still standing. The symbol stones they carved are still being studied. The wall that Rome built at the northern edge of its empire is still visible, running across the northern English landscape, the longest and most impressive surviving monument of the Roman period in Britain. It is visited by millions of people every year. And north of it, the civilization that made that wall necessary, that forced Rome to draw a line and say no further, that held the north against the greatest empire the Western world had ever seen, is still visible in the ground and in the stones and in the genetic inheritance of the people who live in Scotland today. The Picts are not gone. They are the foundation on which everything that came after was built. The archaeology of the Roman frontier in Scotland continues to produce new results. Every year, aerial photography and satellite imagery and LiDAR surveys reveal new sites. Marching camps that were unknown a decade ago are added to the distribution maps. Field systems that lay invisible under improved pasture become visible when crops dry differentially over buried features in a warm summer. The frontier is not a fixed and finished subject. It is an ongoing investigation, and the picture continues to change as new evidence comes in. One of the most significant recent developments has been the recognition of the complexity of the Roman frontier system in Scotland beyond just Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall. The Gask Ridge Towers, as noted earlier, represent a surveillance system predating both walls. But there are also outpost forts north of Hadrian's Wall, at Birrens and Netherby and High Rochester and Risingham, that extended the Roman military presence into the territory between the two walls, even in periods when the Antonine Wall was not held. These outpost forts monitored the approaches from the north and maintained a Roman presence in what was effectively a buffer zone between the province and the hostile territory beyond. They were staffed by units that included scouts, exploratores, trained to operate in advance of the main army line and to gather intelligence about the movements and intentions of the communities to the north. The existence of these scouts tells us something important about the Roman relationship with the north. Intelligence gathering requires contact with local populations. The exploratores were not simply watching from their forts. They were moving through the landscape, observing, collecting information, and almost certainly interacting with local communities. That interaction was bidirectional. The communities of the border zone learned about Rome from these contacts as much as Rome learned about them. The diplomatic relationships, the payments of silver, the exchange of hostages, the treaties that punctuate the Roman relationship with the northern tribes, were all mediated through a network of contacts and informants and intermediaries that operated across the frontier in both directions. The information that the Romans gathered about the north was compiled into reports and records that informed the decisions of governors and emperors. Some of this information made its way into the literary record. Tacitus's account of Agricola's campaigns reflects access to Agricola's own records and dispatches. Dio Cassius's account of the Severan campaigns similarly reflects documentary sources. Ptolemy's map of Britain, with its roster of Scottish tribes and place names, reflects the accumulated geographical knowledge assembled by the Roman state over the period of its engagement with Britain. These records are our best window into what the Romans knew about Scotland and the people who lived there, and they are also, inevitably, shaped by Roman purposes and Roman perspectives. What the northern peoples knew about Rome and how they used that knowledge is harder to access. But it is not inaccessible. The pattern of the resistance itself implies strategic intelligence. The repeated Roman campaigns did not catch the northern tribes by surprise. The confederations that met Agricola at Mons Graupius had assembled a large force which required coordination and communication across a wide area. The leadership of that force had made a decision about where and when to offer battle, and that decision reflected an assessment of the terrain and the relative strengths of the Roman and Caledonian forces. This is not the behavior of a disorganized group reacting blindly to an invasion. This is the behavior of a political and military entity making considered strategic decisions. The same pattern appears in the Severan campaign. Dio's description of the tactics used against the Roman army, the ambushes, the feigned retreats, the targeting of foraging parties, describes a response to Roman military capabilities that was adapted to exploit Roman vulnerabilities. The northern communities knew how the Roman army operated. They knew its strengths and its limitations, and they chose tactics designed to neutralize the strengths and exploit the limitations. This level of tactical sophistication implies an intelligence system of some kind, a mechanism for gathering and analyzing information about the enemy and using it to make military decisions. It implies leadership capable of implementing complex tactics across a dispersed and mobile force. It implies a civilization capable of strategy. The question of where the Picts came from in the deeper historical sense, the question of how the tribal groupings of the late Iron Age became the Pictish kingdom of the early medieval period, is one that archaeologists and historians continue to work on. The consolidation of the northern tribes under a single monarchical structure, a structure that by the 6th century was sufficiently organized to generate the king lists and to engage in the complex diplomatic and military relationships, attested in the Irish sources, was a significant political development. It happened in the shadows, in the period between the end of sustained Roman military engagement in the early 3rd century and the first clear historical references to a Pictish kingdom in the 5th and 6th centuries. The archaeological record provides some guidance, showing continuity of settlement and material culture in the same areas, but the political history of this period is largely invisible. One hypothesis is that the pressure of Roman contact itself contributed to the political consolidation of the north. The sustained threat from the south, the need to coordinate responses across tribal boundaries, the experience of fighting as a confederation against a common enemy, may have created the organizational habits and leadership structures that eventually crystallized into the Pictish kingdom. The Caledonian confederation that Tacitus describes in the Agricolan period and the Maite and Caledoniae confederations that Dio Cassius describes in the Severan period show that the northern tribes were capable of operating as unified political entities when facing external threats. The transformation of those occasional confederacies into a permanent political structure may have been the long-term consequence of a century and a half of Roman pressure. If this hypothesis is correct, then the Pictish kingdom was in a sense a product of the Roman encounter. The Roman Empire, by pressing hard enough against the north to require a sustained political and military response, may have inadvertently contributed to the creation of the adversary it was pressing against. The organization required to resist Roman expansion became the organization that outlasted Roman power in Britain and that shaped the political landscape of early medieval Scotland. Rome's failure to conquer the north was also, paradoxically, Rome's contribution to the political development of the north. The monuments of the Pictish civilization are spread across the landscape of eastern and northern Scotland, and they are accessible. The great symbol stones stand in museums and churchyards and village squares. The stone circles of Aberdeenshire are reachable by road. The brochs are visible on the headlands. The Roman marching camps are visible from the air. The evidence is there, waiting to be looked at, waiting to be read as carefully as we can read it, given the limits of our knowledge. What that evidence shows, above all, is continuity. The people of Scotland before the Romans, during the Roman period, in the Pictish era, and into the medieval and modern periods, are not a series of unrelated populations. They are a single population that adapted to changing political, cultural, and linguistic frameworks, while maintaining the demographic continuity that ties them to the landscape they have inhabited for thousands of years. The civilization that terrified the Romans was the same civilization that produced the symbol stones and the cross slabs. It was the same civilization that gave rise to the Kingdom of Alba. It was the same civilization whose descendants live in Scotland today. The deep roots of that civilization are in the Scottish soil, and they go down very far indeed. The Caledonians who fought at Mons Graupius in 83 CE were not simply warriors with painted bodies standing in a field. They were members of a society with a history of thousands of years in the same landscape, with knowledge of that landscape accumulated across generations, with artistic traditions of real sophistication, with political structures capable of mobilizing large forces and making strategic decisions, and with a cultural identity strong enough to resist not just the military power of Rome, but the cultural power of Rome, the attraction that Roman civilization exerted on so many of the peoples it encountered. The Caledonians looked at what Rome had to offer and chose, for the most part, not to take it. They chose their own way instead, and they were right to do so, in the sense that their way worked. They survived, their civilization persisted, their descendants are still in the landscape that their ancestors knew. The understanding of this civilization has been growing steadily. The advances of the last few decades in the archaeology of Scotland, the aerial photography, the LiDAR surveys, the geophysical surveys at places like Forteviot and Rhynie, the dating programs for the brochs and the symbol stones, the genetic analysis of the modern Scottish population have all added detail and depth to the picture. The Picts, who were once a mystery even to the scholars who studied them, are becoming steadily less mysterious as the evidence accumulates. They are not fully understood. The symbols remain undeciphered. The Ogham inscriptions remain unread. The language is gone. But the material culture is rich. The political history is reconstructible for the later Pictish period, and the genetic continuity is established. The deep question, The question of what it means that the Romans encountered in Scotland, a civilization they chose not to conquer, is one that goes beyond archaeology and history into something more like philosophy. Every human society creates institutions and practices and values that allow it to persist through time. The institutions and practices and values of the Pictish civilization allowed it to persist for something like 8 centuries as a recognizable entity, and before the Pictish period proper, the cultural traditions of the northern Britons go back further still. The hillforts and the brochs and the metalwork traditions and the stone circle traditions all have roots in the Bronze Age and beyond. The civilization that Rome encountered at the northern edge of its ambition was old. It had been working out how to live in that landscape for a very long time. It had developed answers that worked. Rome brought different answers, solutions that worked in the Mediterranean and in the lowland river valleys of Europe, but that were not necessarily better adapted to the conditions of northern Scotland. The Roman agricultural system, dependent on large-scale cereal production on the open plains, was less suited to the upland terrain of the highlands than the mixed pastoral and agricultural economy of the native population. The Roman urban model, requiring concentrated populations in fixed locations, was harder to sustain in a landscape where dispersed settlement patterns were better adapted to the available resources. The Roman road system, the nervous system of the empire, could be built in Scotland, and partly was, but it served an army rather than a civilian economy in the north, because there was no civilian Roman economy in the north. The civilization that the Romans built in southern Britain lasted as long as Rome lasted, and then it began to dissolve. The great villas fell out of use, the towns contracted, the administrative Latin of the south yielded eventually to English. But, in the north, where Rome had never taken hold, the pre-Roman traditions continued, adapted, merged with new elements. As Christianity arrived and as Gaelic and Norse contacts brought new influences, and produced the cultural landscape of early medieval Scotland that we can read in the stones and in the king lists and in the place names and in the genes. The north was poorer in some respects for having been outside the Roman economic system. It did not have the roads and the towns and the administrative infrastructure, but it was richer in other respects for having maintained its own traditions through the Roman period, traditions that remained available as resources when the post-Roman world required them. The people who watch the landscape of eastern Scotland from Benarchy, or from the Gask Ridge, or from the Moray Firth coast today, are looking at a landscape that has been occupied and worked and argued over and prayed over and fought over for thousands of years. The standing stones are still standing. The hill forts are still visible as humped outlines on the ridge crests. The place names still carry their cargo of linguistic history. The Pictish symbol stones stand in their glass cases in the museums or in their churchyards and village squares, still carrying their load of meaning that we have not yet been able to fully read. That unreadability is not simply a deficiency of modern scholarship, though modern scholarship continues to make progress. It is also a statement about the people who made the symbols. They made them for themselves, for their own communities, within a system of meaning that was interior to their civilization and that they did not make accessible to outsiders. They were not trying to communicate with the future. They were communicating with each other, within a community of shared understanding that has since been lost. The symbols endure, but the community of understanding that made them intelligible is gone. What remains is the stone, which is more durable than the understanding, and which will continue to hold its secret patiently until someone finds a way to read it, if that ever happens. The night the Roman army pulled out of Inchtuthil, the night the order was given to break up the fortress, to pull down the walls and fill the pits and bury the nails and march south, was a significant night in the history of Northern Europe. It was the night that an empire with every advantage in organization and discipline and engineering and resources decided that the people to the north were too much trouble. That decision, made in the 3rd year of the reign of the Emperor Domitian, far from Rome, in a half-finished fortress on the bend of the River Tay in Perthshire, established the boundary of the Roman world in northern Britain. And the people on the other side of that boundary, the people who had made themselves too much trouble for the most powerful military organization in the ancient world, went on doing what they had always done. They fished the rivers and farmed the fields. They worked the metal and shaped the stone. They told the stories and maintained the genealogies. They watched the stars and traced the moon. They painted their bodies and blew their carnixes in the high places. They lived. That is what the evidence tells us, in the end. The civilization that was in Scotland before the Romans came, the civilization that resisted the Romans when they arrived, the civilization that continued after the Romans left, was a living civilization, adapted to its place, coherent in its practices, capable of beauty and capable of violence, complex in its social organization, and sophisticated in its intellectual and artistic life. It was not a simple society of painted warriors crouching in the heather, waiting for a Roman patrol. It was a civilization. It just happened to be one that left most of its story in stone rather than on paper, and that makes it harder to read. But the story is there. It has been there for 2,000 years, and we are still learning to read it. The study of Pictish art as a distinct and major tradition within early medieval European art has accelerated significantly in the last few decades. For much of the modern period, Pictish art was treated as a subset of insular art, a regional variant of the broader tradition that included Irish manuscripts, Northumbrian sculpture, and Welsh metalwork. More recent scholarship has emphasized the distinctive qualities of Pictish artistic production, the ways in which Pictish craftsmen adapted and transformed shared conventions into something that is recognizably different from its neighbors. The animal figures that appear on Pictish symbol stones are among the most accomplished animal representations in early medieval art. The bull carvings of Burghead are the most dramatic, but there are also eagles, salmon, horses, deer, dogs, and the enigmatic beast or elephant figure that appears on so many stones that it has become almost a Pictish trademark. This creature, with its long, curved snout or beak, its circular eye, and its distinctive body posture, does not correspond to any known animal, and this has led to suggestions that it is either a stylized representation of a real animal, perhaps a dolphin or some other marine creature, or a mythological beast from the Pictish conceptual world. Whatever it represents, it is rendered with striking consistency and skill across the entire Pictish symbol stone tradition. The consistency of the animal renderings is itself significant. The same beast appears on a stone in Shetland and on a stone in Angus, with a degree of formal similarity that indicates either a single designer working across a vast area, which is impossible, or the circulation of precise exemplars that craftsmen were reproducing, or a training tradition that transmitted the exact forms from one generation of craftsmen to the next. The training tradition explanation is the most plausible, and it implies the existence of workshops or schools in which the Pictish artistic tradition was formally transmitted. Such workshops would have been associated with the major centres of Pictish power, the royal courts and the monasteries, and they would have been among the institutional resources that the Pictish state directed toward the production of its most public cultural expressions. The cross-slab tradition, the elaboration of the simple incised symbol stones into carved relief monuments integrating Christian and pre-Christian imagery, represents the highest expression of Pictish artistic ambition. The great cross-slabs of Angus, the Aberlemno churchyard stone, the Magel collection, the Hilton of Cadboll stone, the Nig cross slab, the Shandwick stone, are monuments of European significance. The Nig cross slab, in Easter Ross, has a back panel showing the Pictish symbols, in conjunction with a figure composition that has been interpreted as showing the meeting of the Desert Fathers Paul and Anthony, fed by ravens, a narrative drawn from early Christian hagiographic literature. The integration of this story, drawn from the literature of the Eastern Christian desert tradition, with native Pictish imagery and with the native symbol system, is a demonstration of the Pictish Church's engagement with the wider intellectual world of Christian learning. The routes by which that intellectual world reached the Picts are worth tracing. The Columban Church was in contact with the Frankish Church, with Rome, and through the pilgrimage tradition with the holy places of the Eastern Mediterranean. Pilgrim travellers from Ireland and Scotland visited Rome and returned with knowledge of Roman Christian art and architecture. The Northumbrian Church, which influenced Pictish Christianity from the south, was itself in contact with Rome, and the Synod of Whitby, in 664 CE, aligned Northumbrian Christianity with Roman rather than Irish practice, bringing Northumbrian art further into the mainstream of continental Christian artistic tradition. The Picts absorbed influences from both the Irish and the Northumbrian streams, and the result was a tradition that was neither simply Irish nor simply Northumbrian, but distinctively Pictish in its synthesis. The ivory carvings associated with the Pictish tradition include some exceptional objects. The street. Ninian's Isle hoard, found in Shetland in 1958, is a collection of 28 silver objects, including bowls, brooches, and a hanging bowl, buried in the late 8th century. The objects are of exceptional quality and reflect the Pictish tradition of high-status metalwork. They were probably buried for safekeeping during the period of Norse raiding, and they were never recovered by their owner. They are now among the most important collections of early medieval Scottish silver in existence. The hanging bowl in the Street Ninian's Isle hoard is particularly interesting. Hanging bowls are a type of object found across early medieval Britain and Ireland, used in unknown contexts that were probably ceremonial. The example from Street Ninian's Isle is decorated with escutcheons, circular metal plates attached around the bowl's rim with decorative hanging attachments that display enameled and decorated surfaces of considerable complexity. The craft knowledge required to produce enameled metalwork of this quality was part of the specialist tradition maintained in Pictish workshops, and the Street Ninian's Isle hanging bowl demonstrates that this tradition was as alive in Shetland as it was in the heartland of the Pictish kingdom further south. The burial of the Street Ninian's Isle hoard and the destruction of Port Mahomac both point to the crisis of the Norse raids in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. The Pictish kingdom responded to this crisis with some resilience. There is evidence of continued monument production and administrative activity in the 9th century, even as the Norse raids were disrupting coastal communities and monastic centres. The kingdom of the Picts survived the first generations of Norse raiding, adapting its institutions and its coastal defences to the new threat. But the combination of Norse pressure from the north and west, Anglian pressure from the south, and the internal dynamics of the relationship with Dalriada eventually produced the political transformation of the mid-9th century that created the Kingdom of Alba. The transformation was not a collapse, it was a reorganization. The institutions of the Pictish kingdom, the administrative system, the ecclesiastical network, the craft traditions, the agricultural base, all continued through the transition. What changed was the linguistic and cultural framing, with Gaelic replacing Pictish as the prestige language. Gaelic Dalriadic kings replaced Pictish kings in the kingship, and the Gaelic cultural tradition gradually displaced the Pictish cultural tradition in the court and the church. But the people were the same people, the land was the same land, and the deep roots of Pictish civilization in the landscape of northern Britain were not severed. They were simply overgrown by the new cultural vegetation of the Gaelic medieval world. The Picts, in a sense, became the soil of Scotland. They did not disappear. They became the substrate on which subsequent Scottish civilization was built, providing the demographic foundation, the landscape knowledge accumulated over centuries, the agricultural systems, and perhaps some of the social and legal conventions that persisted into the Gaelic and later medieval periods in forms that are now difficult to identify, but that were shaped by the long Pictish precedent. Every civilization that has occupied Scotland since the Pictish period has built on the foundations that the Picts laid, knowingly or not. The Romans never got the chance to build on those foundations, and perhaps that is the deepest measure of what the civilization of the North achieved. It survived long enough to become the foundation of everything that came after, rather than becoming the substrate of a Roman province that might have looked like the rest of the empire. There is one more aspect of the pre-Pictish and Pictish civilization that deserves extended attention, and that is the question of religion. The religious life of the Iron Age communities of Scotland, the communities that the Romans encountered, is almost entirely invisible in the written record and is only partially visible in the archaeological one. The Romans described the Druids, the religious specialists of the Celtic world, as practicing human sacrifice and maintaining sacred groves. Roman descriptions of Druidism are, like their descriptions of the Caledonians, shaped by Roman purposes, and the degree to which they accurately describe the religious practices of the northern peoples is uncertain. What the archaeology reveals is a complex relationship with the natural world expressed through the deposition of valuable objects in liminal locations. The tradition of depositing metalwork in rivers, bogs, and lakes is well attested across the Celtic world, and Scotland is no exception. Objects of value, often deliberately damaged before deposition in ways that suggest ritual destruction rather than careless disposal, were placed in water and in wet ground across the pre-Roman and Roman periods. The symbolism of these deposits, the consignment of valuable things to the boundary between the human world and whatever lay beneath the water or within the earth, speaks to a religious sensibility that valued the liminal, the in-between, the threshold between known and unknown. The Pictish religious world was then layered over with Christianity in the 6th and 7th centuries, and the interaction between indigenous religious practices and Christian doctrine is visible in the archaeological and textual record. The persistence of the Pictish symbols on stones that also bear Christian crosses suggests that whatever the symbols meant in their pre-Christian context, they were not simply abandoned when Christianity arrived. They were either reinterpreted in Christian terms, their meaning adjusted to fit the new theological framework, or they were retained alongside the new symbols because they continued to serve functions that Christianity did not immediately displace. The mirror and comb symbol that some scholars interpret as a female identifier may have persisted on Christian cross slabs because the identification of high-status women was a function that the Christian tradition did not provide an alternative for. The holy wells and sacred springs of Scotland, the traditional sites of healing and petition associated with particular saints in the Christian period, often overlay much older traditions of sacred water. The pre-Christian tradition of the healing spring, the site where water emerges from the ground and is therefore a meeting point between the underground world and the surface world, was widespread in Britain and Ireland. Christianity absorbed these sites by associating them with saints, often with stories of the saint purifying or blessing the spring. The Burghead Well, the rock-cut chamber that may be associated with the bull cult at the Burghead Promontory Fort, could be one of these pre-Christian sacred water sites that was later incorporated into the Christian tradition. The souterrains, those underground passages that were probably both practical storage facilities and potentially ritual spaces, may also reflect a pre-Christian religious sensibility about the significance of underground spaces. The descent into the earth, the passage through a narrow stone-lined tunnel into a chamber below the surface, is an experience that in many cultures and religious traditions is associated with passage to another world, with encounter with the ancestors, with initiation into hidden knowledge. Whether the souterrains of Scotland were used in these ways, or whether they were purely practical, is a question that the archaeology cannot definitively answer. But the question itself is worth asking, because it draws attention to the possibility that the underground world was significant to the people who built these structures in ways that went beyond the temperature regulation needed for food storage. The Pictish monastery at Portmahomac was not just a centre of manuscript production, it was also a sacred site, a place where the boundaries between the human and the divine were especially thin, where prayer and learning and the performance of the liturgy created a space distinct from the ordinary world. The sacred geography of early medieval Scotland, the network of holy places, holy wells, holy hills, holy groves that organised the religious landscape of the communities, is only partially recoverable. But enough of it is recoverable to suggest that the landscape of Scotland was understood by its inhabitants as charged with meaning, as a place where the natural and the supernatural interpenetrated at certain locations and at certain times. The henges and stone circles of the Neolithic and Bronze Age were the earliest substantial sacred monuments in Scotland, the first effort to organise the landscape around formally constructed sacred sites. By the Iron Age, those traditions had evolved into new forms, and by the Pictish period, the Christian Church was adding yet another layer to the sacred landscape. At each stage, the new tradition built on what was already there, sometimes literally, as when Christian churches were built on the sites of pre-Christian sacred places, sometimes more figuratively, as when Christian symbols were combined with pre-Christian symbols on the same monument. The continuity of sacred landscape, the persistence of the sense that certain places in Scotland were charged with significance, runs through the whole long history of human occupation. The community of scholars working on Pictish history is small but active. New excavations continue to reveal new information. The geophysical surveys at Rhynie and Forteviot are still producing results. The dating programs for the brochs and the symbol stones are still refining the chronology. The genetic studies of the modern Scottish population are still working through the implications of the ancient DNA evidence. The linguistic analysis of the place name substrate is still identifying pre-Gaelic elements in the Scottish place name record. The decipherment of the Pictish symbol system has not been achieved, but that does not mean it is unachievable. The Mayan script was undeciphered for most of the modern period of Mayan studies and has now been substantially cracked. The Linear B script of Mycenaean Greece was undeciphered for decades and then yielded to a brilliant, sustained analysis. The Pictish symbols may be the next great decipherment problem to be solved, or they may remain permanently opaque, but the effort continues. The wall runs from the Solway Firth to the mouth of the Tyne, 73 miles of stone and turf and ditch and mile castles, and it stands there still. It is the most visible monument of the Roman engagement with Britain in the north. And north of it, in the landscape that the Romans decided they did not want to conquer, the monuments of the civilization they left in place are also still there. The symbol stones and the brochs and the hillforts and the stone circles are still standing. The place names in Pictish and Gaelic and Norse are still on the maps. The people whose ancestors lived through all of it are still in the landscape. The story that begins with ice retreating and humans arriving and standing stones being raised and hill forts being built and brochs going up on the headlands and carnixes being blown in Aberdeenshire and Roman legions marching north and then marching south again and symbol stones being carved and monasteries being founded and Vikings arriving and kingdoms merging, that story is not over. It is still continuing, in the landscape and in the people, and in the investigation that scholars and archaeologists and geneticists are conducting every year. The civilization that was in Scotland before the Scots is not a dead subject. It is a living one, still yielding new information, still demanding new interpretations, still reminding us that the history of human civilization in the north of Britain is older and deeper and stranger and more sophisticated than the standard accounts usually suggest. Rest now, if you want to rest. The story is long and deep, and it will be here when you return to it. The stones are patient. They have been patient for 2,000 years. They can wait a little longer. The research into early Scottish metalwork has identified a tradition that runs from the Bronze Age through the Iron Age into the Pictish period with striking continuity. The techniques of working copper alloys, the casting and hammering and engraving and enamel work, were developed and refined over more than 2,000 years by communities in Scotland, and the sophisticated metalwork of the Pictish period represents the culmination of that long developmental tradition rather than a sudden arrival of new skills. Understanding the metalwork in this light changes how we think about the civilization that produced it. The Pictish craftsmen who made the objects in the Street Ninian's Isle hoard were not learning from scratch. They were working within a tradition that their ancestors had been developing for many generations, a tradition with deep roots in the Scottish landscape and in the social systems that had sustained specialist metalwork production for millennia. The distribution of high-quality Iron Age metalwork in Scotland follows a pattern that corresponds broadly to the distribution of the later Pictish monuments. The concentration of fine metalwork in Aberdeenshire and the Moray area, in Perthshire and Angus, in the Borders and the Lothians, maps onto the areas where the Pictish symbol stones are later concentrated and where the major Pictish sites are known. This distributional correspondence suggests continuity of social organization and cultural investment from the Iron Age through the Pictish period. The communities that could support metalwork production of high quality in the Iron Age were the communities that could support symbol stone carving and manuscript production in the Pictish period. The social structures that generated the resources for one kind of cultural investment were the social structures that generated the resources for the other. The Tor's chamfron, found in a bog in Dumfriesshire in 1816, is one of the most elaborate pieces of Iron Age metalwork from Scotland. It consists of a bronze pony cap with two attached drinking horn terminals that may originally have been separate objects, decorated with flowing latena-style ornament in repousse, that is, hammered from the back to raise the design on the front. The quality of the repousse work is extraordinary. The flowing tendrils and scrolls of the decoration are controlled and precise, varying in width and depth in ways that demonstrate complete mastery of the technique. The surface is also engraved with fine lines that add detail to the larger composition. The whole object shows the same quality of attention and skill that we see in the best Pictish metalwork centuries later, and this continuity is not accidental. It is the outcome of a tradition of apprenticeship and specialist training that ran continuously through the centuries. The social position of craftsmen in Celtic societies is addressed in the Irish literary tradition, which, while later than the period we are discussing, probably preserves conventions that were widespread across the Celtic world. In Irish tradition, skilled craftsmen, like poets and judges and physicians, belonged to a privileged class whose training took many years and whose skills gave them a social status above that of ordinary farmers and warriors. The metalsmith in particular held a complex position associated with magical and transformative abilities, the ability to take raw material and produce from it objects of beauty and power. This association between the metalsmith and the transformation of matter reflects a real understanding of what the smith does, but it also reflects the high status that exceptional technical skill commanded in a society where such skill was rare and its products were valuable. If the craftsmen of Iron Age and Pictish Scotland occupied a comparable social position, then the metalwork tradition was not merely an economic activity but a social institution embedded in the status system and the political economy of the communities that supported it. The patrons who commissioned the finest metalwork were demonstrating their status by their ability to attract and retain craftsmen of the highest skill. The craftsmen who produced the finest objects were demonstrating their social value by the quality of what they made. The objects themselves, circulating through the system of gift exchange and political display that organized the aristocratic societies of the Iron Age and early medieval period, were carriers of social meaning as well as functional objects. The decorated horse harness of the Pictish and late Iron Age period is particularly rich in this respect. Horses were high-status animals, expensive to maintain and powerful as symbols of military and political power. A horse equipped with elaborate decorated fittings was a statement of the rider's wealth and status, visible from a distance and impressive in ways that other status markers were not. The horse pendants and terrets and bridle bits decorated in the Latin and subsequently in the Pictish artistic tradition were not primarily functional improvements to the harness. They were status displays, visual signals directed at other aristocrats and at the general population, encoding information about the rider's social position in a visual vocabulary that the audience could read. The souterrain at Teeling in Angus, excavated in the 19th century and now a scheduled monument open to the public, gives a sense of the scale and quality of underground construction that these communities were capable of. The Teeling souterrain is about 24 meters long, stone-lined and corbelled, with a curved passage that descends from the entrance and widens into a main chamber. The stones are carefully selected and placed, and the corbelling of the roof is executed with skill. Standing inside the Teeling souterrain, in the darkness with the stone pressing close on all sides and the entrance a distant point of light, is to understand something of the sensory experience that these spaces provided. Whether that experience was primarily practical or also partly ritual, the space is distinctive, and the effort of creating it was real. The relationship between the souterrains and the surface settlements they served is being mapped with increasing precision through geophysical survey and excavation. Souterrains were not isolated structures. They were components of larger settlement complexes associated with round houses and field systems and animal enclosures. The settlements they served were farming communities, and the souterrains served those communities in practical ways. But the care with which the souterrains were built, beyond what pure functionality would require, suggests that their construction was considered an important and significant undertaking, not simply a matter of digging a hole and lining it with stone. The continued excavation of roundhouse settlements in Scotland, using the refined techniques of modern archaeological investigation, is producing a picture of everyday life in pre-Roman and Pictish Scotland that is richer than anything available a generation ago. The paleobotanical evidence from these sites, the plant remains preserved in the archaeology, shows the range of crops grown and the diversity of the plant foods in the diet. The faunal evidence shows the management of domestic animals, the species present, and the age at which they were slaughtered, giving information about agricultural strategies and herd management. The pottery evidence shows connections between different communities, the movement of vessels or their contents across the landscape. All of this evidence builds into a picture of farming communities that were not simply subsisting but managing their resources carefully, making long-term investments in soil fertility and herd genetics, and participating in exchange networks that connected them to neighboring communities and to more distant centers of production and distribution. This picture of careful resource management and community investment is consistent with the picture of a civilization capable of building and maintaining the large collective structures, the hillforts, and the brochs, and eventually the Pictish monuments, that have survived into the present. Communities do not build large monuments on the basis of bare subsistence. They build them from surplus, from the resources left over after the basic needs of food and shelter and reproduction are met. The surplus available to the communities of Iron Age and Pictish Scotland was sufficient to support not just the farming activities, but also the specialist crafts, the religious establishments, the political institutions, and the monument building that characterized their civilization at its height. The question of how the Pictish kingdom was organized, what kind of administrative structure it had, is one that the limited written sources address only partially, and that the archaeology addresses in different ways. The Irish annals, which record events in Scotland from the 6th century onwards, give us the names of Pictish kings and occasionally note their conflicts and alliances. They describe a kingdom with a single king at its head, but with regional sub-kings who controlled particular territories. The relationship between the High King and the sub-kings, the degree of central control and the degree of regional autonomy, is not fully articulated in the sources. The legal tradition of early medieval Scotland is largely inaccessible, because the laws were not written down in the Pictish period and because the legal records of the early Scottish kingdom are sparse. But there are hints that the Pictish legal tradition was distinct from the Irish legal tradition, which is well documented. The matrilineal element in Pictish royal succession, if it is historical rather than a later legendary construction, would be unusual in the Celtic world, and might indicate a distinct legal tradition governing inheritance and succession. Some scholars have proposed that the matrilineal succession was a strategy for managing dynastic alliances, allowing the kingdom to be united with a neighbouring polity through a princess rather than a prince, with succession passing through the female line to ensure that the child of a dynastic marriage could be a legitimate heir to both kingdoms. The Pictish king lists give us a list of names that can be checked against the Irish annals for the later period. The coincidence between the names in the king lists and the names mentioned in the Irish annals for the corresponding period is good enough to indicate that the king lists are preserving real historical information, not simply legendary material. At least for the 6th century and later, the early entries in the king lists, before the period where they can be cross-checked against other sources, are less reliable, but they indicate a tradition of historical memory that extended back considerably further than the earliest datable sources. The royal site at Scone, where Scottish kings were crowned on the Stone of Destiny, the stone that Edward I of England stole in 1296, and that was returned to Scotland only in 1996, was already a site of royal inauguration in the Pictish period. The Stone of Destiny itself, a plain sandstone block of distinctive dimensions, has been proposed as a Pictish royal inauguration stone, the stone on which the kings of the Picts were symbolically seated at their inauguration in a ceremony that validated their kingship. The stone's simplicity is striking, its importance entirely a function of the tradition that attached to it, rather than of any intrinsic beauty or elaboration. If the stone was indeed in use for Pictish royal inaugurations before its adoption by the Scottish kingdom of Alba, then it is one of the most direct material links between the Pictish past and the later Scottish state. The inauguration of kings in early medieval Celtic societies was a complex ritual event, involving the symbolic marriage of the king to the land, the validation of the king's right to rule by the assembled aristocracy, and the blessing of the church in Christian kingdoms. The Irish sources describe elaborate inauguration ceremonies in which the king was seated on a special stone and invested with the symbols of royal authority. The Pictish inauguration tradition is only fragmentarily attested, but the Scone stone and the later Scottish ceremony that used it indicate that the Pictish tradition included a stone-centered inauguration that was powerful enough to be adopted wholesale by the successor kingdom of Alba. The hillforts of Pictland, the defended hilltop enclosures that served as the centres of Pictish regional power, are known from a combination of archaeological evidence and historical references. The Pictish royal centre of Dundurn, in Perthshire, was the site of a siege mentioned in the Irish annals in 683 CE, which tells us that it was still a significant military and political centre in the late 7th century. The archaeological excavations at Dundurn have revealed a complex multi-period site with phases of occupation from the Iron Age through the Pictish period, with evidence of high-status occupation in the Pictish phase, including imported pottery and glass. Dundurn was not simply a refuge for emergencies. It was a regularly occupied centre of aristocratic power, with the material furnishings appropriate to a royal or sub-royal household. The fort at Clatchard Craig in Fife is another Pictish hill fort whose excavation has produced evidence of high-status occupation in the early medieval period. The discovery of mould fragments for casting sophisticated metalwork at Clatchard Craig indicates that the fort was a centre of craft production as well as a military and political centre. The combination of defensive fortification and attached craft production is characteristic of the major hill forts of early medieval Ireland and Britain, reflecting the way that aristocratic power and craft specialization were integrated in these societies. The patron who could attract and retain metalworking specialists to a fortified centre was simultaneously securing a military advantage, demonstrating social status, and generating the high-value objects that were the currency of aristocratic gift exchange. The relationship between the Pictish hill forts and the Pictish symbol stones is not fully mapped, but there are some suggestive correspondences. Symbol stones tend to be concentrated in areas where other evidence of Pictish activity is also concentrated. In the regions around the major forts and monasteries and river crossings and other places of political and economic significance, the stones were probably not random in their placement. They were placed in locations where they would be seen by significant numbers of people, where they would communicate their messages to the audiences for whom they were intended. Placing a symbol stone at a river crossing, or at the approach to a major centre, or in the vicinity of a burial ground, was a way of marking those locations with Pictish symbolic meaning, of asserting ownership or authority or commemoration in the landscape. The modern Pictish landscape walk, the tourist route that connects the surviving symbol stones and other Pictish monuments in Angus and Aberdeenshire, passes through countryside that has been farmed continuously since the Pictish period. The fields are larger now, the farm buildings are different, the roads are surfaced rather than beaten earth. But the relationship between the human communities and the landscape, the use of the best agricultural land for arable, the use of the poorer upland ground for grazing, the management of the river valleys for both farming and transport, is not fundamentally different from what it was in the Pictish period. The landscape has been modified, but not transformed. The Pictish farmers who cultivated these fields were working the same soil that their successors have worked for more than 1,000 years since. The Pictish contribution to the genetic makeup of the modern Scottish population has been studied using both the Y chromosome evidence, which traces the paternal line, and the mitochondrial DNA evidence, which traces the maternal line, and more recently using genome-wide analysis, which looks at the whole genome and can detect contributions from multiple ancestral populations. The results consistently indicate that the modern Scottish population carries a substantial component of ancestry that traces back to the pre-Roman Iron Age population of Scotland. This genetic continuity is most pronounced in the areas that were most persistently Pictish, eastern Scotland and the northeastern Highlands, and it is somewhat diluted in the areas with heavier Norse settlement, the Northern Isles, and parts of the Western Seaways. What the genetics cannot tell us, because genetics is about ancestry rather than culture, is how much of the Pictish cultural tradition survived the transition to the Gaelic medieval kingdom. The genetic evidence tells us that the people were there. It does not tell us what language they spoke after the 9th century, what stories they told, what rituals they observed, what memories they maintained of the Pictish past. For that, we have to rely on the archaeological and linguistic and place name evidence, which is thinner and more ambiguous. But taken together, the genetic evidence, the linguistic traces, the place names, and the archaeological record, they build a picture of a civilization that did not simply disappear but transformed, slowly and unevenly, into the Scottish civilization of the medieval and modern period. The Roman literary tradition produced a range of descriptions of the peoples of Britain that, read carefully and with awareness of their purpose and their limitations, tell us something real about the people they describe. Strabo, writing in the early 1st century CE, described the Britons in terms that emphasize their difference from the Mediterranean world, their height, their pallor, their straight hair, their ferocity. He drew on earlier Greek sources, ultimately going back to Pythias of Massalia, who had sailed to Britain in the 4th century BCE and provided the earliest surviving account of the islands. Caesar, whose Gallic wars include accounts of his 2 expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 BCE, gives the most detailed early account of British customs and society, though his campaigns did not reach Scotland, and his observations are about the southern communities. By the time Agricola was campaigning in Scotland in the late 1st century CE, Roman ethnographic knowledge of Britain had been accumulating for over a century. The accounts produced by Tacitus, Dio Cassius, and later writers drew on this accumulated tradition, as well as on direct observation and intelligence reports from the campaigns themselves. The picture of the Caledonians that emerges from these sources is of a people adapted to a harsh environment, physically large and fierce in battle, resistant to the discipline that distinguished Roman armies from their opponents, and organized in a way that made them difficult to defeat decisively, despite their inferiority in formal military tactics. Tacitus's account of the Agricolan campaigns, the Agricola, is one of the most carefully constructed works in Latin literature, and its treatment of the Caledonians is shaped by Tacitus's literary and political purposes in ways that a modern critical reader needs to keep in mind. Tacitus was writing a biography of his father-in-law, designed to celebrate Agricola's achievements and implicitly to criticize the Emperor Domitian who had recalled him. The Caledonians in the Agricola functioned partly as a foil for Domitian's Rome, their fierce independence and their contempt for luxury contrasting with the corruption and moral decline of the imperial court. This does not mean that the information Tacitus provides about the Caledonians is false, but it means that the information has been selected and shaped by considerations that go beyond pure historical reportage. The same caveat applies to all Roman accounts of the northern peoples. They were written by Romans, for Roman audiences, within Roman literary conventions that shaped what was noticed, what was emphasized, and what was omitted. The Caledonians and the later Picts did not write about themselves in a form that has survived. They are seen entirely through the lens of an outside observer whose perspective was shaped by the assumption that Roman civilization represented the highest form of human achievement and that the peoples beyond its frontiers were to be understood in relation to that standard. Keeping this asymmetry of the sources in mind is essential to reading them accurately. What comes through, even after discounting for the rhetorical purposes of the Roman writers, is a sense of a people of considerable vitality and resilience. The consistency of the accounts, across different writers working at different times and for different purposes, in describing the northern Britons as fierce, mobile, enduring, and difficult to pin down, suggests that this characterization has a basis in reality. The Roman army did not find the north of Scotland easy, and the writers who described those campaigns, whatever their other purposes, were transmitting the military reality that the campaigns had been costly and that the results had been unsatisfying. The Antonine Wall, whose abandonment twice is one of the most significant facts about the Roman frontier in Scotland, deserves more consideration than it usually receives in popular accounts. The wall was built in the 140 SCE under the Emperor Antoninus Pius, running for approximately 39 miles from Bridgeness on the Firth of Forth to Old Kilpatrick on the Firth of Clyde. It was built of turf on a stone base, with a military road along its south side and a series of forts at regular intervals. The forts on the Antonine Wall were more numerous and more closely spaced than those on Hadrian's Wall, suggesting that the Romans anticipated greater pressure on this frontier than on the more southerly line. The Bridgeness distance slab, found during the construction of the Forth and Clyde Canal in 1868, is one of the most impressive surviving pieces of Roman monumental sculpture from Scotland. It is a large rectangular limestone slab carved in high relief with scenes celebrating the construction of the eastern end of the Antonine Wall by the Second Augustan Legion. On the left panel, a Roman cavalryman rides over 4 naked figures, representing the defeated enemy. On the right panel, soldiers perform a religious ceremony, a suovitorilia, the sacrifice of a pig, a sheep, and a bull. Between them, the central panel gives the dedication in Latin, stating that the Second Augustan Legion built this section of the frontier, a distance recorded in paces. The slab is a declaration of Roman power, carved in the style of metropolitan Roman public sculpture and placed at the eastern terminus of the wall as a statement of imperial achievement. But the achievement was transient. The Antonine Wall was abandoned for the first time within a generation of its construction, with the Roman frontier pulling back to Hadrian's Wall. It was briefly reoccupied, possibly in the 160 SCE, and then permanently abandoned. The reasons for the first abandonment are debated. The most likely explanation is that sustained pressure from the communities north of the wall made holding it too costly, and that the strategic calculus favoured the more southerly and more defensible Hadrian's Wall line. The turf construction of the Antonine Wall, while quicker to build than the stone of Hadrian's Wall, was also less durable and less impressive, and maintaining it against determined attack would have required constant repair and reinforcement. The communities that were pressing against the Antonine Wall from the north were the same communities that had resisted Agricola's campaigns a generation earlier. They had watched the Romans build the wall. They may have used the construction period to observe Roman methods and assess Roman vulnerabilities. They certainly applied enough pressure to the completed wall to force 2 withdrawals within a relatively short period. The repeated abandonment of the Antonine Wall is not a Roman military failure in the sense of a catastrophic defeat. It is a strategic withdrawal in the face of a cost-benefit calculation that kept coming out unfavourably. But the fact that the calculation kept coming out unfavourably reflects the effectiveness of the resistance. The hill known as Arthur's Seat, the ancient volcanic plug that rises above Edinburgh, takes its name from the Arthurian tradition, and the possible connection between the Arthurian legends and the peoples of northern Britain has been explored by many scholars. The historical Arthur, if there was one, is usually located in the post-Roman period of the late 5th and early 6th centuries, when the withdrawal of Roman power left a power vacuum that various British warlords attempted to fill. The traditional localization of Arthur in the southwest of England is one tradition, but there are Scottish and northern British candidates for the historical Arthur, including figures from the kingdom of the Caledonians in the Edinburgh area. What matters for the history of the pre-Scottish civilization is not whether there was a historical Arthur, but what the Arthurian tradition tells us about the political world of the post-Roman North. The earliest Arthurian references in Welsh literature, including the poem Y Gododin, which mentions Arthur in a way that implies his fame was already established when the poem was composed in the late 6th or early 7th century, place Arthur in a world of competing British kingdoms fighting against Anglo-Saxon expansion from the east and struggling to maintain their political independence. This world is recognizable as the successor to the Roman frontier zone, the territory of the Votadini and the Gododin and the other tribes of southern Scotland and northern England who had spent centuries in close contact with Roman civilization and who were now trying to navigate a post-Roman world without Roman support. The Y Gododin, as already noted, describes a raid from Edinburgh south to Catterick in Yorkshire in the early 7th century. The warriors who made that raid, who are described in the poem as the finest fighters of their generation, who were feasted for a year at Edinburgh before setting out, and who died almost to a man in the fighting at Catterick, were the descendants of the Votadini, who had maintained the uneasy relationship with Rome for 4 centuries. Their poem is a lament, a memorial of the dead, composed in the tradition of Welsh praise poetry that goes back into the Iron Age. It is also one of the earliest substantial poems in any British language, and its existence demonstrates the cultural vitality of the communities of the Scottish borders in the immediately post-Roman period. The connection between the Gododin and the later Scottish literary tradition is indirect but real. The Welsh language in which Y Gododin is composed is closely related to the Cumbric language of the Strathclyde Kingdom and to the language spoken by the communities of the Scottish borders before Northumbrian and then Scottish domination, established English as the dominant language of the area. The Brittonic literary tradition of northern Britain was the tradition within which the Gododin warriors were commemorated, the tradition that maintained the memory of the pre-Gaelic peoples of the north, and its persistence into the medieval period in Wales is one of the ways in which the civilization of the northern Britons left a trace in the cultural record that has survived. The monastic network of early medieval Scotland, the complex of religious houses established across the landscape from the 6th century onwards, was one of the most significant institutions of Pictish civilization in its developed form. The monasteries were not simply places of prayer. They were economic centers, producing food and goods and services for the surrounding communities. They were educational centers, training clerics and craftsmen, and administrators in the skills needed to maintain the complex society of the Pictish kingdom. They were centers of record-keeping, maintaining the genealogies and king lists and land records that were the administrative memory of the kingdom. And they were centers of artistic production, generating the manuscripts and the carved monuments that represent the most visible surviving achievements of Pictish culture. The monastery at Iona, founded by Columba in 563 CE on the small island off the southwest coast of Mull, was not itself a Pictish foundation. It was established in the territory of Dalriada, the Gaelic kingdom of the west. But its influence reached into Pictland, and the daughters and granddaughters of Iona's traditions spread through Scotland in the following century. The Columban church was organized in a way that was different from the Roman church, with the monastery rather than the bishop as the organizing unit of ecclesiastical administration, and the abbot of Iona exercising an authority that extended far beyond the immediate community of the island. This network of connected monasteries, spread across Scotland and Ireland and eventually into northern England, was a mechanism for transmitting learning and artistic tradition and political influence across the boundaries between the various kingdoms of the north. The artistic tradition that produced the Book of Kells, now housed in Trinity College, Dublin, and widely considered the most beautiful book in the world, was a product of this monastic network. The Book of Kells was probably produced at Iona or at one of the monasteries associated with the Columban community, possibly in the late 8th or early 9th century, in the period immediately before or during the first Norse raids. The monks who made it were working in a tradition that had been developed across multiple monasteries over multiple generations, and the Pictish contribution to that tradition, through the artistic exchanges between the Pictish church and the Columban community, is visible in some of the stylistic elements of the manuscript. The decorated pages of the Book of Kells, the carpet pages and the Chiro page and the pages of the four evangelists represent the culmination of a tradition that had been developing for over a century. The interlaced knotwork, the zoomorphic interlace, the geometric patterns, the figural scenes, all draw on a repertoire of motifs that had been developed in the workshops of the insular monasteries through a process of exchange and competition and refinement. The Pictish symbol stones show some of the same motifs in an earlier and perhaps less refined form, and the Pictish cross slabs of the 8th and 9th centuries show the same motifs at a level of sophistication equal to the manuscripts. This parallel development, in stone and in vellum, in 3 dimensions and in 2, was the product of a shared tradition maintained across the monastic network. The craftsmen who carved the Nig cross slab or the Hilton of Cadboll stone were drawing on the same reservoir of motifs and techniques as the monks who illuminated the pages of the Book of Kells, and the results are comparable in quality. This is not a coincidence. It reflects the integration of Pictish artistic production into the wider insular tradition through the connections between the Pictish church and the Columban monastic community. The Viking raids that damaged this tradition so severely in the late 8th and early 9th centuries were targeted at wealth, and the monasteries were the wealthiest institutions in early medieval Scotland. The liturgical silver and gold, the illuminated manuscripts with their precious pigments and their gilt covers, the imported Mediterranean ceramics and glass, the fine textiles, all represented concentrated portable wealth of a kind that was extremely attractive to raiders who had the mobility and the military capacity to reach these coastal and island locations. The monks of Iona suffered 3 major raids between 795 and 806, with the loss of the last raid being recorded at 68 members of the community. The disruption to the manuscript tradition and the artistic tradition that these raids caused was severe and long-lasting. The response of the Pictish and Dalriadic church to the Viking threat was partly withdrawal, moving communities and their treasures inland to less vulnerable locations. The Book of Kells may have been moved to the monastery of Kells in County Meath in Ireland, precisely to protect it from Norse raiding. Relics and liturgical objects were moved to inland centres. The community at Portmahomac, on the Tarbat Peninsula, which projects into the Moray Firth and was therefore exposed to seaborne raiders, was damaged or destroyed in the early 9th century, and the focus of Pictish monastic activity shifted to less exposed locations. The late Pictish and early Scottish political world was shaped by these pressures: the Viking raids from the north and west, the Northumbrian pressure from the south, and the internal dynamics of the relationship between the Pictish kingdom and Dalriada. The merger of the two kingdoms under Kenneth MacAlpin in the mid-9th century was a response to these pressures as much as it was a dynastic achievement. A unified kingdom with a single royal house was better positioned to respond to external threats than two competing kingdoms, and the Dalriadic tradition of maritime warfare, developed in the island environments of the West, complemented the Pictish tradition of land-based defense of the eastern heartland. The outcome of that merger, the Kingdom of Alba that emerged from the mid-9th century, was in many ways a continuation of the Pictish kingdom under new management. The territory was largely the same. The population was largely the same. The administrative structures were adapted from the Pictish precedents. The church remained in its established locations, though the relative importance of different centres shifted as Gaelic became the language of the court and administration. The great Pictish monasteries that survived the Viking raids, including the community associated with the Pictish royal site at Dunkeld, became important centres of the new kingdom's ecclesiastical life. The Stone of Destiny, the inauguration stone now housed in Edinburgh Castle alongside the Honours of Scotland, carries all of this history in its simple sandstone form. It was used for the inauguration of Scottish kings in the medieval period, and before the Scottish kingdom, it was in Pictish use, and its origins before the Pictish period are unknown. It travelled to Scone from wherever it originated. It was used for the inauguration of kings who saw themselves as heirs of a tradition going back into the Pictish past, and it was stolen by Edward I of England in 1296 as an act of political symbolism designed to deny Scotland its own royal heritage. Its return to Scotland in 1996, 700 years after its removal, was a gesture of political symbolism in the opposite direction, acknowledging the continuity of Scottish identity and the importance of the material symbols through which that identity is expressed. The stone is heavy, grey, unadorned, and enormously significant. It is a piece of the Pictish past that survived, in one form or another, into the present. The coast of Scotland, the extraordinary length of coastline generated by the sea locks and the island chains and the deeply indented bays, was not just a geographical feature of the territory, but a fundamental part of how Pictish civilization organized itself. The long coastline meant long maritime routes, and those routes connected the Pictish heartland to the Norse world to the north, and the Irish world to the west, and the Northumbrian world to the south. The Picts were not a landlocked people. They were a maritime people, at least in their coastal regions, and the political and economic relationships with the neighbours were mediated in significant part through seaborne contact. The evidence for Pictish maritime activity is thinner than the evidence for their land-based practices, because boats do not survive well in the archaeological record, and because the documentary sources rarely describe maritime activity in detail. But the distribution of Pictish symbol stones in Orkney and Shetland tells us that the Pictish cultural sphere extended across those waters, and the presence of high-quality Pictish metalwork in locations that can only be reached by sea tells us that valuable objects were moving along those sea routes. The Street, Ninian's Isle hoard in Shetland, the finest collection of Pictish silver anywhere, is in an island that can only be reached by boat, and the hoard's very existence there tells us that Shetland was integrated into the Pictish exchange network through maritime connections. The currents and the winds of the seas around Scotland are not uniform and not always favourable. The North Sea between Scotland and Scandinavia is cold and can be rough. The Minch between the Scottish mainland and the Outer Hebrides is notorious for its unpredictable conditions. The Pentland Firth between Caithness and Orkney is one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the world, with tidal races of extraordinary speed and violence. The people who travelled these waters regularly needed detailed knowledge of their conditions, the tidal patterns, the seasonal wind patterns, the locations of safe anchorages and dangerous rocks. This knowledge was accumulated over generations and transmitted through the communities that depended on maritime travel for their connection to the wider world. The boats that the Picts used for these journeys are not well documented. The hide boats, curraghs, that were used in the Irish tradition were certainly in use in Scotland, as they have been used on the western coasts into the modern period. Log boats, dugout canoes made from single large tree trunks, have been found in Scottish lochs and are likely to have been used for shorter journeys on inland waters. Plank-built boats, using strakes of planking either lashed or nailed to a frame, may also have been in use, though the evidence for this is limited. The maritime technology available to the Picts was sufficient for the journeys that the evidence shows they were making, but the details of that technology remain to be more precisely established. The fishing economy of the coastal Pictish communities was probably of great importance, both as a source of food and as a source of tradable commodities. Dried and salted fish could be stored and transported, and the cold, nutrient-rich waters around Scotland were then, as now, extremely productive for fish. The Moray Firth in particular was then, as now, a rich fishing ground, and the communities around its shores would have had access to large quantities of fish. The processing of fish for storage and trade requires infrastructure, salt, storage buildings, transport vessels, and the organization of fishing fleets, and the presence of all this in the Pictish period is implied by the evidence, even if its details are not directly attested. The connection between fishing and the sea provided another form of knowledge that the coastal Pictish communities possessed, the knowledge of the sea's behavior, its moods and its seasons, its dangers and its gifts. This knowledge had spiritual as well as practical dimensions. The sea was a boundary and a road simultaneously, the edge of the known world and a route to other parts of it. The sea locks that penetrated deep into the Highland Massif brought the quality of the sea's edge into the interior of the country, and the communities at the heads of these sea locks lived in a landscape where the sea was always nearby, always present as a feature of the environment and as a presence in the cultural imagination. The long evening light of the Scottish summer, the lingering northern twilight that stretches the day almost to midnight in midsummer, was a constant companion for the people of Pictish Scotland. The extreme seasonality of light at high latitudes, the brief days of winter and the extended days of summer organized the agricultural year and must have organized the ceremonial and religious year as well. The monuments aligned to solar and lunar events, the stone circles and the souterrain orientations and the positioning of major buildings, reflect a civilization that paid close attention to the movements of the celestial bodies as a way of understanding and marking the rhythms of time. This astronomical awareness was not merely practical, though it had practical applications in timing agricultural activities. It was also a way of connecting the human community to the larger patterns of the universe, finding meaning in the regularities of the sky. The inscription on the stone at the end of the day, the setting of the symbol in the landscape, the lighting of the lamp in the monastery as darkness fell, the management of the fishing boats as they came in from the Firth, were all aspects of a civilization that was alive and complex and connected to its world. The Picts were not simply the people before the Scots. They were the people who made the ground on which Scotland stands, who gave the landscape the first human layer of its long accumulation of meaning, who looked at the sky and the sea and the stone, and found there the materials for a civilization that lasted for centuries and that left its mark permanently in the country we now call Scotland. The mark is still there, in the stones and in the ground and in the people, waiting for those with enough patience and enough curiosity to read it. The rivers of Scotland were also highways, and the communities along them were connected to each other and to the coast by the same network of waterways that drained the Highland Massif. The River Tay, which drains a large part of Perthshire and flows into the North Sea through the Firth of Tay, was navigable for substantial vessels for a significant distance inland. The Roman fort at Inchtuthil, the legionary fortress on the Tay, was positioned partly because the river provided a supply route from the sea. The Pictish royal centre at Fortified, also on the Tay drainage system, was similarly positioned to take advantage of the river as a communication route. The communities at intervals along the river, the farmers and the fishing communities, and the people who moved goods between the coast and the interior, were connected to each other through the river in a way that made the Tay Valley a coherent economic and cultural unit long before any political authority imposed its own coherence on the landscape, whether Roman or Pictish. The River Dee in Aberdeenshire flows from the High Cairngorms through a broad, fertile valley to the North Sea at Aberdeen. The Upper Dee Valley, Deeside, is one of the most productive agricultural areas in the northeast of Scotland, and its fertility was recognised and used long before the Pictish period. The concentration of symbol stones in Aberdeenshire reflects partly the agricultural wealth of the area and its capacity to support a dense and prosperous population. The rivers of the northeast provided water, fish, communication routes, and the fertile land between them provided the agricultural surplus that sustained the social complexity visible in the symbol stones and the hill forts and the fine metalwork of the period. The peat bogs of Scotland, covering large areas of the Highlands and accumulating for thousands of years on the wet upland plateaus, are one of the most important archives of early Scottish history. The low oxygen, high acid conditions within active bogs preserve organic material that would otherwise decay completely. Pollen preserved in the peat tells us what plants were growing in the surrounding landscape at different periods. The pollen record from Scottish bogs gives a detailed picture of how the landscape changed over time under human influence. The clearance of woodland for agriculture, the spread of arable land, the management of upland pastures, all leave signatures in the pollen that allow reconstruction of the agricultural history of the landscape. The pollen record for the Pictish period shows a landscape already extensively modified by human activity, with significant arable land and managed pasture, woodland reduced from its post-Ice Age maximum, and heathland widespread on the uplands. The Picts were farming a landscape their ancestors had worked for thousands of years. It always had been,